Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that are both themed around the same thing: true crime stories with a shocking plot twist at the end. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Basketball with Friends, and it is about a brutal crime that has two significant plot twists. The second story you'll hear is called What Happened in Room 348, and it is about a crime, or more specifically a crime scene, that made absolutely no sense until detectives noticed a very small detail. The first story, Basketball with Friends, is very distressing and involves harm to a minor. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get the 5-star review button's car detailed, but as soon as they give you the keys, simply fill their car with an angry pack of Asian murder hornets. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Basketball with Friends. Right in the middle of the United States is a quiet little town called Millstadt, Illinois. Millstadt is home to about 4,000 people, and had it not been for Ashley Reeves, only those 4,000 people and their friends and family would even know that Millstadt existed. In 2006, Ashley Reeves was a 17-year-old high school student who lived with her parents and her younger sister Casey in Millstadt. Ashley was an excellent student who, even though she was over a year from her high school graduation, she was already thinking about what colleges she wanted to go to. She was also extremely likable and outgoing, and she had this huge, infectious smile. And so she had tons of friends, and she had a very serious boyfriend who her parents adored. His name was Jeremy, and he was a high school student as well. On the morning of Thursday, April 27th of that year, Ashley got up, and like every other morning, she got ready for school alongside her sister Casey. And then right before Ashley stepped out to head off to school, she told her parents that after school, she had a job interview on the other side of town. And then after her interview, her plan was to play basketball with some friends, and then she'd be home. And so her parents said, okay, well, hey, good luck with your job interview, and just make sure you're home before 10:30 p.m. And so Ashley said, no problem, I'll see you tonight, and then she left. That afternoon, after school, Ashley made her way to Jeremy's locker, and when she got to him, Jeremy handed her his keys to his car. He had an SUV, and he was lending it to her for the day so she could go to the interview and then go play basketball. And so Ashley took the keys, she thanked him, she gave him a hug, and then she turned and she walked down the hallway where she met up with her sister Casey at her locker. And then the two girls left the school, they went out to the student parking lot, they found Jeremy's SUV, they hopped inside, and then Ashley began driving them back to their house. When they got there, Casey hopped out of the car, she said bye to Ashley, and then Ashley left their house and she began driving to Fairview Heights, which was a town about 15 miles away where her interview was going to be. Several hours later, around 10 p.m., Ashley's parents had not heard from their daughter, and it was getting close to her curfew, and so they asked Casey if she had spoken with Ashley, and, did she know how her interview went? Did she know when she was going to be home? But Casey would tell them, actually, no, I haven't talked to Ashley since she dropped me off from school. And so Ashley's parents said, okay, no big deal. And they called Ashley, but Ashley didn't pick up. So they sent her a series of text messages. But after a couple of minutes of not getting any response, they decided to just call her boyfriend, Jeremy, to see if maybe he knew what was going on with Ashley. But when they spoke to Jeremy, he would say that, I haven't spoken with Ashley since I gave her the keys to my SUV. And I've actually been trying to talk to her all day. I've been calling her and texting her, but I still haven't heard back. And so at this point, Ashley's parents were starting to get really worried. And so after hanging up with Jeremy, they began calling other friends of Ashley's to see if maybe they had spoken to her and knew what was going on. But all of her friends that they spoke to all had the same story. We haven't talked to her since the end of school, and she's not returning our calls or texts. And so Ashley's mother, she just sensed that something was terribly wrong. And so without any hesitation, she just called the police. Now, the police in this town were used to getting calls every now and again from parents whose teenage child had run off and they were concerned about them, but virtually every time the police investigated, they would find the teenager had just kind of been blowing off their friends and family, and they would pop up maybe a couple hours later totally unharmed. But the Millstadt police would later remark when they heard Ashley's mother's voice over the phone, the fear in her voice was so pronounced, it immediately pushed the police department to take this case very seriously. And so that night, right after this phone call, the Millstadt Police Department went out in force to try to locate Jeremy's SUV, the car that Ashley had been driving around that day. And the first place they went to look for this car was Latterman Park, which is this very popular public park that has a really popular basketball court that lots of teenagers would go to all the time, and Ashley was known to frequent that park. And this park was located about halfway between Fairview Heights, where her interview was, and Millstadt, where she lived. And so they go to Latterman Park, and right away, sitting in the parking lot, they find Jeremy's SUV. But Ashley is not in the car, she's nowhere near the car, and when they searched the car, there was nothing of significance inside of it. There was just some of Ashley's clothes lying around. The police would spend all night and well into the morning combing Latterman Park looking for any sign of Ashley, but there wasn't one, and so as the sun came up and the police were nowhere closer to finding this girl, they began to suspect that, perhaps foul play was involved. And so the first person they hauled in for questioning was Ashley's boyfriend, Jeremy. But as soon as he sat in the interrogation room, he demonstrated a real concern for Ashley, he had a rock-solid alibi, and he basically was an open book, and so they quickly ruled him out as a suspect. And then the police basically began hauling in all of Ashley's friends and acquaintances and family members, basically anybody that knew her. They were bringing them into the station to find out if they knew anything that could help them figure out where Ashley was. And more specifically, the police were really looking to see if any of these people were hiding something. And sure enough, a few of the friends that were brought in were. According to a few of Ashley's closest friends, Ashley was in not one, but two romantic relationships. One was the public relationship she had with Jeremy, and the other was a secret relationship that was actually illegal. In order to hide this forbidden second relationship, Ashley would tell her family and her friends that she was going to the park to play basketball, when in reality, she was going to the park to meet up with this secret second partner. And the day before, when Ashley went missing, her friends told police that that was the exact reason she was going to Latterman Park. The police got the name of this secret person from Ashley's friends. His name was Sam Shelton, and the police tracked him down. When they found him, he was at a baseball practice, but the police didn't care. They marched right on to the baseball diamond, and they grabbed Sam and they brought him back to the police station. And then when he got there, they sat him down in the interrogation room, and he's still wearing his baseball uniform, and they asked him about his relationship with Ashley. And he immediately denies it and says he does not have a relationship with Ashley. He's got no idea why he's here. But pretty quickly, after a few questions, Sam's answers became inconsistent. And so the police just ratcheted up the pressure on him. And then finally, after 12 hours of questioning, the interrogator brings up Sam's mother and his grandmother. And he says to Sam, how would they feel if they knew you were lying to the police right now? And this just broke Sam. And so he cracked. Now, at this point, the police were already expecting the worst when it came to Ashley, but they were not ready for just how brutal Sam's confession would be about what exactly he did to her. The following is an account based on his confession. 30 hours earlier, Ashley wrapped up her interview in Fairview Heights, and she made her way to Latterman Park to meet up with Sam. And now it's not clear exactly how they met up, but eventually the two of them did connect and they made their way over to Sam's car where they became intimate. Afterwards, the two are sitting in the front two seats of Sam's car. Sam is in the driver's seat and Ashley is in the passenger seat. And while they're sitting there, something happens that causes this huge fight between the two of them. And at some point, Sam tells Ashley to get out of the car. But Ashley refuses. She wants to talk to him. She wants to deal with their issues, but Sam's not having it. And so he gets so mad at her that he lunges across the center console of the car and he puts Ashley into a vicious chokehold. Now, he tells police his plan was to kind of yank her out of the car, but he squeezed so hard around her neck that he heard this loud popping sound coming from her neck. It was the sound of her neck breaking. And so as soon as he heard it, Sam let go, and Ashley kind of crumpled forward and hit the front dashboard of the car. And so Sam is staring at her, wondering what he should do. He's kind of looking around, making sure no one saw what he just did. And then he reached over and lifted her back up to see if she was still alive, and he saw she was. But instead of trying to get her help, he decides right then and there he's going to kill her. And so he reaches over and he begins choking her. But after several minutes of throttling her, she just wouldn't die. And so Sam pulled his belt off of his waist and he wrapped it around Ashley's neck, and then he began pulling. But he would tell police he couldn't stand looking at Ashley's face while he did this. He said she was staring right at him, her tongue was coming out of her mouth, she was frothing, and her face was turning this ghastly shade of gray-blue. And so at some point, when she still hadn't died, he released the belt from around her neck, and he turned her body so she was facing the window away from him, and then he repositioned the belt on her neck, and then he put his foot on her back to use as leverage, and then he pulled as hard as he possibly could on her throat for quite a while until the belt actually broke around her neck. And then at that point, he checked to make sure she was dead, and when she was, he stuffed her down into the floorboards in front of the passenger seat, and then he drove several miles across town to another park called Citizens Park that was very heavily forested. And once he parked in the parking lot, he looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he dragged Ashley's body out of the car and deep into the woods where he abandoned her. It would turn out Ashley was far from the only teenage girl who found Sam Shelton attractive. Many teenage girls in the area thought he was the perfect catch. He was smart, he was handsome, and he had these beautiful, striking blue eyes that you couldn't help but just stare at. However, there was something unique about Sam that made him fundamentally different than all the other guys at their schools. Sam was not a student. He was a 27-year-old middle school teacher in Millstadt, and he also was the high school baseball coach. He had never been Ashley's teacher directly. However, years earlier when she was in middle school, he had begun grooming her for exploitation. And so fast forward to 2006 when she was 17, he had effectively manipulated her into believing she was in this romantic relationship with him, when in reality, he was just using his position of power to abuse her. In addition to being a school teacher, Sam was also an aspiring pro wrestler. He would often compete in local showcases under the nickname The Teacher. While Sam was probably nowhere near good enough to actually become a professional wrestler like you would see on TV, he was extremely strong and really knew how to do a chokehold. And so when he attacked Ashley and put her in that vicious chokehold, she had no chance at escaping. She was completely doomed. Shortly after his confession, Sam would tell the police that he would take them out into the forest of Citizens Park to try to find Ashley's body. But when they got there, it was late, it had been raining for several hours, and Sam right away acted like he couldn't figure out exactly where he had left her. And so the police were actually starting to think, is he lying to us? Is this whole thing just kind of made up? Did he really attack her? Is she really out here? But after about 30 minutes of the police and Sam kind of trudging around the thick forest, one of the officers suddenly sees something on the ground. He raises his flashlight, and there in a clearing is Ashley's body. And so the police and Sam, they walk over to her, and they're standing above her ruined body. Her neck is totally bent at a grotesque angle. She's covered in bugs. But as they're standing there and they're watching her, her chest suddenly starts to move. She wasn't dead. She had been left for dead, and she had been out in the woods with a broken neck for 30 hours in the freezing cold and the rain. She only had a t-shirt and some pants on, but she was alive. And so moments later, the paramedics, they come rushing into the forest, they pick her up really gently, they bring her out, and they rush her to the hospital where she'd be put into a medically induced coma. The doctors would tell her family that, unfortunately, her injuries were just too serious, and we don't expect her to ever wake up again. But miraculously, she would. Now, she would have to relearn how to walk and talk and eat and drink, but she would do all of those things, and today she is 32 years old, she is happily married, she has 2 kids of her own, and by and large, she leads a very happy, normal life. As for Sam Shelton, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for attempted murder, and he's still in prison today. However, he is up for parole in 2024. The next and final story of today's episode is called What Happened in Room 348. On September 15, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas to start his work week. As a young man, Greg had worked as a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months out at sea. but in his middle age, he had reinvented himself as a landman. It was Greg's job to secure leases of mineral rights and land for drilling. Greg was slender and fit-looking despite the fact that he never exercised and he smoked constantly. He kept a close-cropped white beard, and he had the leathered skin of a lifelong outdoorsman. Every Monday morning, Greg would make the 2-hour commute in his pickup truck from Lafayette, Louisiana, all the way to Beaumont, Texas, where his company would always rent him a room. The hotel itself was neither good nor bad, but to Greg, he didn't care. He just needed a bed and a TV. Once Greg walked inside, he had a bathroom immediately to his right, and then a little bit farther in was the main section of the hotel room, which was very basic. Straight ahead, there was a window that looked down onto a small pool that was lined with potted plants. And then in the main space was a queen-size bed tucked up against the right wall, and then on the left wall was a TV. Greg wheeled his one suitcase into the hotel room, and he put it at the foot of the bed, and he opened it up. He pulled out the shirts that he wanted to keep wrinkle-free for the week, and he hung them in his closet. Then he pulled out his toiletries that were kept in a cloth bag with a hook, and he hooked those onto a towel rack. Then he took off his very worn brown boots and his faded blue jeans, and he slipped on some pajama pants. Anytime Greg stayed at the Elegante, he rarely left his room. There was a bar downstairs, but he wasn't a big drinker or socializer. He preferred to just have quiet nights alone in his room watching TV. So that night, Greg cranked the air conditioning to make sure it was as cold as it could get. He liked to sleep in a very cold room. And then he hopped on his bed and he put 2 big pillows behind his head and he rested up against the headboard. And then he took a towel and he laid it out next to him. And on the towel was his ashtray, his cigarettes, his lighter, his phone, the TV remote, and a candy bar. Then he picked up the TV remote, turned it on, flicked through the channels until he landed on one that was playing Iron Man 2, and he thought, good enough. Put the remote down, picked up his candy bar, opened it up, he ate a piece of his candy, and then he grabbed a cigarette, lit up a cigarette, and he began smoking. The following morning, Susie, Greg's wife, did not get a call from her husband. And he always called her every morning that he was gone. That was their routine, and this was a big break from their routine. And so she tried calling him, and his phone rang and rang and rang, and he never picked up. And so then she called his Beaumont office, and he didn't pick up. But after the second or third time she called, his coworkers picked up the phone, and they said, hey, Greg's not here. He hasn't come into work yet. And Susie felt concerned. She felt like something was wrong. And she said, do you guys mind just going to his hotel room and knocking on his door and making sure he's okay? And they said, sure, we'll go over there. So the 2 coworkers head over to the hotel, they knock on Greg's door, he doesn't answer, and so they go down and get the manager, who comes up and opens Greg's door, and right away they find Greg lying dead in the middle of his hotel room. The way Greg was positioned when they found him, it looked like he had fallen to his knees and then fallen again onto his face, and his left arm got kind of tucked underneath his body, and still in his 2 left fingers was a cigarette that had not fallen from his hand that had burned down to the wick. The room was exceptionally warm, and Greg's skin was grayish blue. Immediately after seeing Greg, the 2 coworkers called 911. Shortly after the ambulance arrived at the hotel, Detective Scott Apple arrived in his cruiser. Apple was a short guy, very, very fit. He had silver hair that he spiked up. He looked 100% cop, and he worked basically 24/7. When he got up to room 348, there was no sign of a break-in, nothing had been disturbed inside of the room, and there was no blood or obvious wound on Greg, with the exception of a slight abrasion on his cheek when he came down and hit his face on the rug. He looked around the room and he found Greg's wallet that was sitting in the back pocket of his jeans, and there was hundreds of dollars in his wallet that had not been taken, so he ruled out robbery. He went out into the hall and he began interviewing the other occupants of the surrounding rooms, and no one had heard anything and no one had seen anything. He went back into the hotel room and he began looking around for drugs of any kind or any substance that Greg might have taken that could have contributed to his death, and there was nothing. No prescription pills, no alcohol, nothing. Later that day, after the family had been notified of Greg's passing, his grief-stricken wife, Susie, called Detective Apple, and she said, my husband did not take good care of himself. He had a terrible diet. He's been smoking like a chimney since he was a young teenager, and he never saw a doctor. And I always told him that if he wasn't careful, something like this was going to happen. I always worried that he might have a heart attack or something. So at this point, not only does Greg's family think he died of natural causes, Detective Apple also thinks the same thing. He's thinking about what he saw in the hotel room, and there's no sign of any foul play. It just looks like a guy whose lifestyle caught up to him. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, who in Beaumont, Texas, he was like the medical examiner. He'd been doing this for years and years. Dr. Brown had read ahead that they believed Greg had died of a heart attack or something like that. And when his body was wheeled in front of him, there was nothing he saw right away that contradicted that theory. The only 2 marks that the doctor noted on the outside of Greg's body was the small abrasion on his face from where he landed on the rug, and then he also had another small abrasion on his crotch. But beyond that, the rest of his body was completely unblemished. When he looked inside of his body, it looked like someone had literally just crushed his insides. His torso was full of blood, food from his intestines had been ripped outside, he had ribs broken, internal organs were lacerated, and there was a hole in his heart. Dr. Brown was really confused at what he was looking at, because the severity of Greg's internal injuries were more consistent with someone who had been in a severe car crash or who had had a really heavy object land on them, but Greg didn't have any significant external injuries that would support either of those two things happening to him. And he was found in the middle of a hotel room where there was nothing disturbed and no one had apparently seen or heard anything. And so Dr. Brown says, look, I don't have all the answers here, but this was not natural. This is a homicide. And my best guess is he was beaten to death. I know it doesn't really make sense because there's not any external injuries, but he suffered some significant trauma from somebody else, and that's what killed him. When Detective Apple got this report from the medical examiner, he was just as confused as Dr. Brown was, but his attention turned to, okay, well, if he's been murdered, who would want to murder him? And he began digging into Greg's background, and he found that he was universally liked. He was known for being incredibly courteous and polite. He kept to himself. He was in love with his wife, and his wife loved him back. There was no evidence of some scandal in the background. He was just this really nice, normal guy, and it didn't make any sense why anybody would want to kill him. After a few months of getting nowhere, and in reality, he hadn't really even gotten started because there wasn't any good starting point. The only thing he could find that was odd about the crime scene was that the room was particularly warm when they walked inside, which was not in keeping with how Greg would have kept the room. But that doesn't explain why his insides were crushed. And so he's gotten nowhere, and then he makes a discovery. He found in the hotel's maintenance logs on the night Greg died, he had been making popcorn in his microwave and managed to blow a fuse. And it wasn't just his power. Maybe Greg didn't know this, but he cut the power to both the room next to him on his right and on his left and below him. And so he calls down to the front desk and a maintenance guy came up and he reset the breaker. This opened the door to two theories. The first theory is the maintenance guy, who did have a criminal record, when he came up to fix the breaker, he attacked Greg. But that was wildly speculative and there was no evidence to suggest that the maintenance guy would do that, and so that was quickly ruled out. The other theory was Greg's neighbors in room 349 were these two electricians who were big partiers and drinkers, and so Detective Apple suggested that maybe when Greg accidentally cut the power to their room, they were really annoyed and they went outside in the hall and they saw Greg and they somehow realized he was to blame for this, and in a drunken rage, they attacked him and killed him, and that's what killed Greg. And even though it was a stretch, it was the closest thing to a motive Detective Apple had found in anyone. And so Detective Apple put on a hidden camera and he went and interviewed these two electricians that were still staying in room 349. And he said when he spoke to them, they were very forthcoming. They seemed very honest. They were appropriately curious about what happened to Greg. And all they said was, look, we had no interaction with him. We did hear him coughing when we came back from the bar. We were at the bar that night, but honestly, that's the extent of our interaction with him. The electricians offered up their cell phone numbers, their email addresses, and said, anything you need from us, we'd be happy to help. We're really sorry this happened. At this point, Detective Apple is back to square one. No one knows what happened to this guy. The one big lead he had, the maintenance records, proved to be a total dead end. And so unfortunately, this case went cold. 7 months after Greg's death, where there had been absolutely no traction on figuring out what happened to him, Susie, Greg's wife, decided she wanted to hire a private investigator. And her friend suggested she call Ken Brennan, who was a famous private detective who was well known for being able to solve really complex cases. And so on a whim, Susie calls Ken Brennan, not expecting to get through to him, thinking he's probably super busy and has other cases because he's on TV and he's this really famous guy. But he picked up the phone and he was like, hey, how can I help you? And Susie couldn't believe it. She had a chance to tell him about what happened to her husband. And Ken said he was really interested and that he would take on the case. Ken was a former Long Island cop and he was a DEA special agent. He spoke with a really thick New York City accent and he wore t-shirts that were a little bit too small to show off his muscles, and he usually had a big gaudy gold chain on. Once Ken agreed to take on this case, he flew right to Lafayette, Louisiana, where Susie lived, and he sat down and he asked her a lot of really difficult questions about their marriage, about whether she thought he might be cheating on her, if he had like a secret life she didn't know about. And after feeling satisfied that all those avenues have been explored and were not going to lead to the answer, he said, okay, well, can you tell me anything about the crime scene that stood out to you? Is there anything about it that seems off? And Susie said, yeah. Greg always kept the air conditioning on very cold at night. he never slept in a room that wasn't freezing cold. And so I thought it was really odd when his coworkers discovered him that the air conditioning was off and it was really hot inside of the room. That's incredibly unlike Greg for his air conditioning to be off. Ken made a note of this, and then he left Lafayette and he went to Beaumont, Texas to meet up with Detective Apple. And Detective Apple and he actually got along really well. They agreed to work together on this case because Detective Apple feels like he's reached a dead end anyways. Apple brought Ken to the crime scene, he showed him the hotel room, and then afterwards he turned over all of the documents he had on the case, from the autopsy report to the photographs to anything he'd collected over the 7 months he'd been working on it. So that night, Ken diligently looks through all of the documentation, all of the photos, and the next day when he goes into Apple's office, he says to him, "I think I figured it out." And Apple's like, "Oh, really? You figured it out one day after being here?" And Ken's like, "No, seriously, I think I figured it out. I have to confirm something with his wife, but I think I have a theory." And so Ken calls Susie right in front of Apple, and when Susie picks up, Ken's like, "Hey, did your husband ever smoke with his left hand, or did he smoke with his right hand?" And Susie said, "Oh no, he only smoked with his right hand." And Ken goes, "Thank you very much." He hangs up and he goes, "Apple, I got it." And so Apple's like, "Okay, what's your theory?" And Ken says, "Okay, so I spoke to Susie and she told me it was very strange that his room was not air conditioned when they discovered his body, because Greg was known for always turning on the air conditioning to as cold as it can get, especially at night when he went to bed. And so when his power went out the night before, his air conditioning would have gone out. And so the maintenance guy comes up, turns the power back on, but it doesn't trigger the air conditioning to turn back on. The room is still cold from having been air conditioned all evening to that point. And so the TV is back on, and so perhaps Greg turns and just starts watching TV. Because the room feels air conditioned, he hasn't realized that he hasn't turned the air conditioning back on again. Now, this is Beaumont in the summer, so it's going to get really hot in his room really quickly, and as soon as it starts to warm up in there, he's going to realize, "Oh, I didn't turn the AC back on," and he would go over and turn it on again. And so because the air conditioning wasn't on, and we know that the power was restored at 8:30, then he must have died after the power was on, but before it got warm enough in the room for him to recognize he did not turn the AC on, which means he would have died somewhere between 8:30 and 9 p.m. at night. And so Apple's like, "Wow, that's pretty impressive, except that doesn't really help us figure out how he died or who killed him." And Ken puts his hand up and he says, "I know, I'm just building the whole picture here." Okay, so we have him dying between 8:30 and 9, and I don't think he was beaten to death. I think a lot of people want that to be what killed him because it's kind of the only thing that might make sense, but I say it definitely doesn't make sense because of the cigarette. Now, we found that cigarette in his left hand, and I talked to his wife, and she said he only smokes in his right hand. And so what I think happened is the power came back on at about 8:30, which is what the report says. The TV turns back on. Greg doesn't turn the air conditioning back on. He sits on his bed. He's watching TV. He lights up a cigarette and he's smoking with his right hand. And then something happens to him, which I'll get into my theories on that. And he jumps off the bed and he starts making his way to the door to get help. And he transfers the cigarette from his right hand to his left hand so he can use his right hand to turn the doorknob and open the door to safety. But he doesn't make it. He falls to his knees and he falls to the ground, and his cigarette's still in his fingers, and he dies. And Apple's like, "You know what? That's pretty good. It makes a lot of sense. But the crucial missing piece here is, well, what was the trauma he suffered that caused him to jump from his bed and run to the door and then ultimately die?" Ken's like, "I got a theory on that too, but I got to be in the hotel room to see if it's true." So Apple and Ken go back to the hotel room. When they get there, Ken goes inside and he starts walking around, looking at the ceiling, the wall, the ground. And then finally he stops when he's looking back towards the front door leading back into the hall. And he points at the wall and he says, "There." And Apple looks at what he's pointing at, and it looks like there had been some patchwork on the wall in the same spot where the doorknob, when it swings open, would hit the wall. And so Apple's looking at it and he's like, "That's just from the doorknob." And so Ken takes the door and he opens it all the way to where the doorknob is pressed against the wall, and it's to the right of this patchwork, meaning this patchwork is not connected to the doorknob. Apple was confused and was about to ask questions, and Ken was like on a roll, and he said, "Hold on." And he goes outside, he goes next door to room 349, they go inside, and Apple walks in the room and he's watching Ken do his work, and Ken's rubbing his hands all over the wall, and eventually he stops and he looks up at Apple and he takes his finger and he pushes on one spot in the wall as Apple is watching, and his finger goes right in. And what he pushed on was this little chunk of toothpaste that had been wedged in this little tiny hole in the wall, and he pushed it through. Apple brought in a crime scene investigations unit who carefully excavated both sides of this wall, and they shined a laser from 349 into Greg's room, and the trajectory of the laser going through this hole lined up perfectly with where Greg would have been sitting on the bed, smoking cigarettes, eating candy, watching a movie. So Ken and Apple go back to the medical examiner, Dr. Brown, and they say, look, you missed something because Greg got shot. And unfortunately, Greg's body had already been cremated, but they did have the pictures to look at from the autopsy. And sure enough, they find that little tiny laceration in his crotch was actually an entrance wound. And then when Dr. Brown pointed out there was a hole in the heart, it kind of lined up with the trajectory that bullet would have been traveling through his body. Dr. Brown realized he had made a mistake and he changed the autopsy report to reflect a gunshot wound. Ken and Detective Apple re-interviewed one of the electricians that had been in room 349 that was in the room where the gunshot had originated from. His name was Lance. And when they brought him in, they said, this is totally routine. You know, it's been 7+ months since Greg's death. And what we're doing is any of our witnesses, we want them to sign a statement, basically attesting that this is what I saw or didn't see. And so they had prepared a statement that basically lined up with the first thing he had told police, which was, I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything. And they said, is there anything you want to change about your story? Or is this exactly what you saw and heard? And Lance said, yeah, that's exactly, I don't know anything. I wish I knew more. I'm sorry. And like, all right, well then can you sign this document saying that you don't know anything and you didn't see anything? And he said, yeah. He signs the document, and then Ken's like, all right, gotcha. Because we know a gunshot was fired from your room and that's what killed Greg. And so you need to tell me who shot the gun. Otherwise, I'm taking you to jail for submitting a false police report. At this point, Lance crumbles and the truth comes out. And he said that he and the other electrician in the room with him, whose name was Muller, they were goofing around and drinking that night. And Muller went out and got his pistol from his car and he brought it in. And he was goofing around with it. And Lance was saying that he was trying to get him to stop doing that, but he kept goofing around with the gun. And at one point, he aimed the gun at Lance and Lance kind of batted it away from him. He dropped the gun, it landed, and it went off. And they saw where the bullet hole was. They saw it was into Greg's room, and they both froze and they listened to see if anybody had reacted to this gunshot. And he said they didn't hear anything for a long time, and that made them believe that no one was in the other room, that no one was in Greg's room, and that they were in the clear. And so they left and went to the bar. They didn't even think to check on whoever was in that room. And when they came back, they said they heard Greg coughing in his room, and that further confirmed that he must not have been in there when they fired the shot, and he's totally fine, and they are totally in the clear. The next day, Lance said when they saw his body being taken out, at first they did think, oh my goodness, this is us. We did this. But they overheard Detective Apple walking around interviewing people saying out loud that, yeah, we think this is natural causes. Yep, looks like a heart attack. This is probably nothing. I'm sure it's nothing. And they were like, oh, phew, it's not us. And so they actually believed it was just a coincidence that on the same day they're firing a rogue bullet into Greg's room, that Greg had a heart attack and died separately. But Lance would say that somewhere in the back of both of their minds, they knew they probably had something to do with it. And so they covered their tracks and they put toothpaste in the wall to cover up the hole, and they hid the gun, and they intentionally kept information from the police. And so ultimately Muller, the owner of the gun, the one who really instigated that night, waving the gun around, and the one who actually dropped the gun, he was charged with manslaughter and was given 10 years in prison. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to get the 5-star review button's car detailed, but as soon as they give you the keys, simply fill their car with an angry pack of Asian murder hornets. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that share a theme: crazy mysteries that were actually solved. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Batman, and it's about a totally insane secret that eventually got out and made headlines all around the world. The second story you'll hear is called The Weirdest Murder Motive Ever, and as the title suggests, it's about a murder with a truly baffling motive. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please recrust the 5-star review buttons Smucker's Uncrustables. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called Batman. On August 22nd, 1922, shots rang out from inside a stately Victorian home in Beverly Hills where Dolly and Fred Ostrich lived. Neighbors called police right away, and when officers stepped into the front door, they saw the entire house was trashed. On the floor in the living room was Fred, who had been shot to death, and next to him were 3 .25 caliber shell casings. With weapons drawn, the police cleared the entire first floor. There was no one down there. They heard screaming coming from upstairs, and so they run up the stairs, and they get up there, and no one's upstairs. And then they heard the screaming again, and they realized it was coming from inside of a closet in the master bedroom. And so as the police are clearing the second floor, they yell out to this woman, and they say, "Who are you? What are you doing in the closet?" And she yells back, "I'm Dolly. I'm okay, but I'm trapped." And so after the police finish clearing the upstairs, and they're sure it's safe, they go over to the closet door, and they do try the handle, but it's locked. They ask her, "Do you know where the key is?" And she says no. And so before they start trying to break the door down, they did a quick search of the upstairs to see if maybe they could find the key to the closet. And sure enough, across the hall in another bedroom, they found it on the ground. And so they took the key back, they opened the door up, and out came Dolly. She was okay, but obviously very frantic and panicked. And they asked her, what happened? And she told them a very abrupt and chaotic story. She said she had been hanging clothes inside of this big walk-in closet, and her back was to the door when she heard a fight break out on the first floor. And before she could even turn around to go investigate, she said the closet door was swinging shut, and then she heard it lock from the outside, and she didn't get to see who it was that shut the door. The whole thing was a bit of a head-scratcher for police, because they're thinking, okay, well, was it one person that attacked Fred downstairs and then ran upstairs and shut and locked the door immediately afterwards before Dolly could come out and see? Or was there 2 people, one person downstairs attacking and one person upstairs shutting and locking the door? Or was it more than 2 people? And despite the house being totally ransacked and there being lots of valuable stuff in their house, Dolly said the only thing she could tell was missing was the diamond-encrusted wristwatch that Fred always wore. It was not on his wrist when they discovered his body. And why, detectives wondered, were these burglars or this burglar carrying a .25 caliber weapon? Something that small was more likely to be found in a woman's purse than in a home invasion. When police spoke to neighbors, they were quick to say Fred and Dolly fought all the time, and earlier that night they had gotten into a really bad one. But as much as police wanted to point the finger at Dolly, it was just impossible for her to have committed this crime. Because how could she have murdered Fred and then ran upstairs and locked herself in the closet from the outside and then also somehow deposited that key across the hall in another room? It just didn't make any sense. But since the police had little else to go on, they dug into the new widow's past. Dolly was born in Germany in 1880, and following a move to Milwaukee, Wisconsin just before the turn of the century, she married Fred, who was 3 years older than her. Fred was driven and successful, but he was also a raging alcoholic and prone to violence. And so as Fred built up his textile empire, opening up factory after factory all across the Midwest, their marriage grew strained. He was mean, and she was lonely. When they moved from Milwaukee to Southern California in 1918, their new neighbors immediately were aware of the fact that Dolly and Fred fought loudly and often, and they frequently bickered in public. Police looked high and low to see if Dolly had maybe taken a lover, but no one had ever seen her with anyone but Fred. And so while they might be miserable, they seemed to be faithful. And so try as they might, the police could find no clues that suggested anything darker or more dangerous than a petty and meaningless marriage. The case hung open, and suspicion continued to trail Dolly, even though it was physically impossible for her to have committed the crime. Now free from her unhappy marriage, Dolly moved into a new home in Los Angeles, and she took up with her estate lawyer, Herman Shapiro, who was handling her husband's $1 million estate. But just like her late husband, her new boyfriend, Shapiro, worked long hours, and he was not around much, so she was lonely all over again. So she went out and got another boyfriend, a guy by the name of Roy Klum, and she began seeing the men at the same time. A year after Fred's death, Captain Herman Klein of the Beverly Hills Police Department dropped by Dolly's estate lawyer/boyfriend's office. Detectives were still suspicious of Dolly, even though the case still made no sense. And so Captain Klein goes into Shapiro's office, and wouldn't you know it, sitting on the desk is this beautiful, diamond-encrusted wristwatch that looks an awful lot like the watch Dolly claimed was the one thing stolen from her house on the night of her husband's murder. When the captain asked Shapiro how he got this watch, Shapiro told him that Dolly had given it to him as a gift, but I know where you're going with this because I thought the same thing too. I know about the missing diamond watch on the night of the murder. I asked Dolly about it when she gave it to me, and she told me that that was actually a mistake. The watch was never missing, and she later on found it tucked underneath a sofa cushion in the living room. The captain was not buying this, and so as soon as he left Shapiro's office, he immediately confronted Dolly about the watch, and Dolly said, you know what, that's right, I did find the watch, but I didn't think it was that important, so I didn't tell you guys. The captain couldn't believe what he was hearing, and shortly after, the newspapers found out about this new twist in this totally bizarre case, and they went wild with it, putting all the heat back on Dolly. Spooked by the headlines, Dolly's second boyfriend, Roy Klum, came forward to the police and said, I have a confession to make. Dolly made me hide one of her .25 caliber pistols, and I threw it in the La Brea tar pits. And then before police could even go get that gun, one of Dolly's neighbors came forward and said, yeah, I got a confession to make. Dolly asked me to get rid of a .25 caliber pistol, and I buried it in my backyard. So police went out and recovered both weapons, but they were so badly rusted, they couldn't confirm if they were in fact the murder weapons. And Dolly had an excuse. When the police confronted her with these guns, she said, oh yeah, those old things, I've had those in the house for years, but, given the circumstances of my husband's death, just felt a little awkward keeping them around the house, so I had some friends get rid of them. The police were not buying this, and so in July of 1923, they arrested Dolly for killing Fred. But despite these new developments, the facts of the case had not changed. It was still physically impossible for Dolly to have committed this crime. She was locked in the closet from the outside. And so with Dolly in jail awaiting trial, investigators tirelessly hacked into her story to try to find holes in it, but they had no success. And so after every theory that might connect her to the crime was ultimately discarded, they had to drop the murder charges and Dolly was released. 7 years went by and the crime was largely forgotten about. And then in 1930, Dolly and her estate lawyer boyfriend Shapiro, they broke up. And Shapiro immediately called the police and said, you know what? I haven't been entirely truthful. I know a lot more about what happened to Fred than I've let on. And in fact, I have someone in the office with me right now that can tell you the whole story. Investigators flew to Shapiro's office, they go through the doors, and sitting inside is a man they never knew existed. His name was Otto Sandhuber. He was a quiet, small sewing machine repairman / aspiring dime store fiction writer. And the story he would tell them would be more bizarre and lurid than any investigator could have imagined. It began almost a decade before the murder. When Otto was a teenager, he had worked for Fred in one of his Milwaukee factories. One day in 1913, Dolly complained to Fred that her sewing machine was broken. And so Fred asked one of his employees, who he knew was a sewing machine repairman, the then 17-year-old Otto, if he would go over to his house and fix the sewing machine for his wife. Dolly knew her husband was going to send Otto specifically to their house, and she was very attracted to Otto. And so when Otto showed up, all she had on was a silk robe, stockings, and heavy perfume. Thus began Dolly and Otto's affair, which at first they conducted in a pretty typical way, meeting secretly in hotels, but when that became burdensome, they moved their relationship back into the ostrich home, with Otto needing to sneak in and out around Fred's schedule. But it wasn't long before nosy neighbors were asking Dolly, who's that strange man coming around your house all the time? And she would say, oh, that's my vagabond half-brother. But Dolly and Otto knew they couldn't continue in this way. But instead of breaking it off or returning to secret hotel liaisons, Dolly decided that Otto should take up residence in the ostrich home in a secret hideaway in the attic. That way no one would see him coming or going. Otto, who had no family to miss him, quit his job at the factory, moved into the secret room, and then never left. And pretty quickly, Otto and Dolly fell into a routine where when Fred would leave for work for the day, Otto would come downstairs, they'd spend time together, and then Otto would clean the house and then make bathtub gin. Before Fred came home, Otto would sneak back upstairs to write pulp stories about lust and adventure, and he would read newspapers and magazines by candlelight. Around this time, Fred started complaining to Dolly about strange noises in the house. He also started to notice they were running through food a lot faster than normal, and a couple times he thought he was short a cigar. But no matter how much Fred complained, Dolly was always able to convince him that everything he was hearing and seeing was in his head. And so over the next 5 years, they would live in 4 homes in Milwaukee, and always these strange sounds and oddities about the house would follow them, but Fred never investigated. In 1918, Fred told Dolly he wanted to move to Southern California, and so Dolly hunted down a house with an attic, a rarity in the area, and she sent Otto ahead. When Fred and Dolly arrived, Otto was already ensconced in the attic, and Fred moved in right beneath him. By the time Fred and Dolly got in their final argument on the night of August 22nd, 1922, Otto had been secretly living with them for almost a decade. On that deadly night, Otto was in his secret room listening to drunk Fred getting louder and angrier and clearly getting physical with Dolly. And so worried that he might kill his lover, Otto leapt out of the attic and ran downstairs carrying 2 .25 caliber pistols. He runs into the living room and he confronts Fred. And Fred is astounded to see his formerly teenage sewing machine repairman, who abruptly quit the factory so suddenly and completely, now standing in his living room. And so Fred lunged at Otto, and Otto just started shooting. It was then that Dolly hatched the scheme that had almost let them get away with it. Knowing the police would be there any minute, Dolly staged the house to look like a robbery. She told Otto to lock her inside of the closet and then ordered him to go back up into the attic. And so when the police got there, Otto was crouched silently right above their heads. After the killing, Otto moved in with Dolly in her new house, and even though they could have had a normal open relationship, Dolly ordered Otto to go live in the attic of this new house as well. It wasn't until a year later, when Dolly was briefly arrested after the police found out about the hidden guns, that Otto was forced to come out of the attic. While Dolly was sitting in jail for these gun charges, she begged her estate lawyer boyfriend, Shapiro, to go get groceries for her vagabond half-brother, Otto, who lived in her attic. She said, when you delivered them, make sure you go to the bedroom and knock on the ceiling. That will let him know it's safe to come out. But when Shapiro arrived and followed the procedure and Otto came out, Otto was so starved for human interaction and conversation that he wound up telling Shapiro the whole insane story. But instead of going to police, Shapiro told Otto that he should just leave. And he did. He went and became a janitor and he got married. The secret held until Dolly and Shapiro broke up for good, at which point Shapiro called the police. Dolly and Otto were arrested and the press went insane. They called this the Batman case because Otto was living like a bat in a cave. This was before Batman the comic was a thing. Otto was convicted of manslaughter, but the statute of limitations was up, so he was allowed to walk free. As for Dolly, she was allowed to walk free too because the jury hung on her conspiracy to commit murder charges. After the trial, Otto disappeared and nothing more is known about him. As for Dolly, she stayed in LA and she died in 1961 at the age of 80, 2 weeks after marrying yet again. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Weirdest Murder Motive Ever. When classes began at Drexel University in Philadelphia on the morning of November 30th, 1984, students walking into Randall Hall made a gruesome discovery. Crumpled at the bottom of an outdoor stairwell underneath a gray jacket was the body of a young woman. She had cuts and bruising all over her face, and she had a deep purple line that went all around her neck from where she had been strangled to death. She had no purse, no backpack, nothing to identify her. There was no evidence of sexual assault because she was fully clothed, although she was missing her shoes and socks. Police immediately cordoned off the area. Their first suspicion was this was a robbery that turned deadly. But right away, the police knew they were in for a very difficult investigation because, one, there were no cameras inside or outside of Randall Hall, so they couldn't just review the footage to see what happened to Debbie. And two, there was a virtually unlimited number of suspects because Drexel University was not an isolated campus. Its buildings were integrated into West Philadelphia, and Randall Hall itself was located right along a known cut-through that residents that lived in and around Drexler would use almost every single day. And it was clear this young woman had not been killed in this stairwell. She had been killed elsewhere and then dragged a great distance, losing her shoes in the process before being dumped at this spot. But just a couple of hours after the body was discovered, the police received a lucky break when a young man who was combative and frantic rushed the closed-off crime scene and demanded he be let through because he said he knew the identity of the dead girl. The police were immediately suspicious because they didn't even know who this dead girl was. So they pull the young man aside and they interview him, and he tells police his name is Kurt Rayner, he's a student at Drexel University, and he believes the girl they had found, the dead girl, was his girlfriend, 20-year-old Debbie Wilson, who was also a student at Drexel. And then he proceeded to give police a very long and complicated explanation of how he figured out the girl inside was his girlfriend. He said the night before he was with Debbie in Randall Hall in the computer lab in the basement. He said Debbie had a big project that was due the next day and that he had offered to just keep her company while she worked. But by about 1:30 in the morning, Debbie still had a lot of work to do, and Kurt said he was just really tired and didn't know if he could stay awake any longer, and so he asked Debbie if it would be okay if he took off early. Debbie said it was totally fine. She was used to working late at this computer lab, and Kurt, even though he wanted to stick around and walk her safely to her car when she was done, he felt like she was okay, and so he took off on his own. On his walk back to the dorm, Kurt said he passed by a campus security guard, and he actually asked him if he wouldn't mind checking on his girlfriend in the computer lab because she was all alone and it was late, and the security guard said, "No problem, I'll make sure she's okay." The next morning when Kurt woke up, he heard rumors from other students on campus about a woman's body being found just outside of Randall Hall and that apparently it looked like murder. Kurt said he didn't think much of it at first, but that day when he went into campus to meet up with Debbie, he saw her car still parked in the computer lab parking lot, looking like it had never left. And then when he got to the meeting site, Debbie never showed. And he said it was at that point that he realized the dead woman in Randall Hall must be Debbie. And he wasn't wrong, it was Debbie, but the police were not buying his story. He was the last person to see Debbie alive, and by his own admonition, he had heard that morning about a dead woman being found at Randall Hall, the very place he had left his girlfriend the night before all alone. But it took him hours to bring this up to anyone. The police also noticed he had bruises on his knuckles and a deep cut between his fingers. Suddenly, Kurt seemed like the killer, and this crime that initially looked like a robbery gone wrong now looked like something much more personal. Strangulation is intimate. The killer almost always is face-to-face with their victim, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of rage. And afterwards, the killer had covered Debbie's body with her jacket, an act that indicated remorse or even respect, and investigators know that generally when a woman is murdered, her romantic partner is the culprit. Instead of tipping off Kurt that they were looking at him as the primary suspect, they told him to go back to his dorm room and they would be in touch with him as the investigation developed. In the meantime, investigators turned their attention to the computer lab in Randall Hall, where Kurt said Debbie had been last. Debbie had logged into a computer at the front of the lab, but had not logged out. Her computer cursor was left blinking mid-sentence at 1:38 a.m., leading investigators to believe she was interrupted by her attacker inside of the lab. Investigators found 2 extension cords on the ground near this computer that matched the ligature marks on Debbie's neck. They also found a small spot of blood on the back of Debbie's chair that they sent off for testing. As police swept the computer lab, they began commenting on how neat everything looked, considering that there must have been some sort of death struggle that took place in there. And that's when they realized there had been a huge setback in this case. The janitor that morning had cleaned the computer lab and the hall right outside, likely destroying critical physical evidence. They interviewed the janitor, who had a rock-solid alibi and was incredibly remorseful at unintentionally destroying the crime scene. And so they asked the janitor, before you cleaned it up, was there anything strange about the computer lab or the hallway right outside of the computer lab? And the janitor said no, it was all normal, but she did say it looked like the tables and chairs had been moved around inside of the computer lab, but it didn't stand out to her because it always looked that way when she went in to clean it up. Because the police lacked physical evidence, they couldn't just go arrest Kurt, even though they wanted to. And so instead, they asked him if he'd be willing to come down to the station for a formal interview. He said he would. During the interview, Kurt insisted he had nothing to do with Debbie's death. As for the bruises and cut on his hand, he said he had punched a wall after finding out what had happened to Debbie, and the cut in the middle of his fingers was from working on his car, but neither of those things could be proven. After this interview yielded no new results and they still had no evidence on Kurt, they told him he could go, and in the interim they began digging into his alibi. Kurt had previously told police that after leaving Debbie in the computer lab, on his walk back to his dorm, he had passed a security guard and asked that security guard to check on Debbie. And so the police were able to track down that security guard who confirmed Kurt's alibi, The security guard's name was Bryce Clapman, who was a longtime employee of Drexel University with a stellar work record and no criminal history. Clapman said he spoke with Kurt around 1:30 in the morning as Kurt was walking back towards the dorms. After speaking with Kurt, Clapman radioed Bronson Ziegler, who was one of the 2 security guards that were working in Randall Hall that night, and he told him that he or the other guy, David Dixon, would need to go down into the basement and check on this girl. Shortly after radioing Ziegler, Clapman would say he saw a person, presumably a student, come out of Randall Hall. He said he was just too far away and it was too dark that he couldn't make out any features, but he definitely saw someone walking around the premise around 1:30 in the morning. Clapman told police he never stepped foot inside of Randall Hall that night and that he was willing to take a lie detector test. Police ran the backgrounds of Bronson Ziegler and David Dixon. Dixon was a military veteran with a pristine record who was still in the Army Reserves. As for Ziegler, he had spent time in jail for burglary and had actually lied about it to get his job as a security guard. When police interviewed Ziegler, he was evasive and frustrated, and he said that he did receive the message from Clapman to go check on the girl, but he didn't feel like doing it himself, so he radioed Dixon and said he should go do it. Ziegler insisted he had done his rounds properly and he had never stepped foot inside of the computer lab. He told detectives they could check his security guard clock that he carried with him every time he did rounds, which was basically like a punch card where there was designated stations along his security rounds where he would punch this card that stamped a time that he had arrived at that station. And so over the course of the night, he would punch his card at each of these stations, and there was a record of what time he arrived and what time he left. And so when they checked this record, it showed that Ziegler had hit all the stations at the correct time. But that didn't mean he didn't kill her, because there was lots of time in between rounds that he could have attacked her. Towards the end of the interview, Ziegler accused detectives of messing with him, and then he sarcastically said he had killed Debbie, and then he refused to take a lie detector test. When the police interviewed Dixon, he said that Ziegler had never radioed him asking him to check on the girl in the computer lab. However, he did say he was aware of someone working late in the computer lab because around 2:15 in the morning he had walked past and the lights were on and he heard the sound of printers working inside. And so not wanting to disturb whoever was in there, he didn't even poke his head in. He just figured he would come back in a couple hours and make sure they were gone. And so over the next couple of hours, he chatted on the phone with his girlfriend. And then around 4 in the morning, he went back down to the computer lab and the lights were off and the door was locked. And so he figured whoever had been in there had finished up and left, and Ziegler had locked up after them. When asked why he or Ziegler had not discovered Debbie's body, he said their security rounds did not leave the building, and so that stairwell was considered outside of the building, and so they never would have seen her. At this point, Clapman and Dixon were ruled out as suspects, but Ziegler became a primary suspect. But just as with the boyfriend, Kurt Rayner, there was no physical evidence tying Ziegler to the crime, and so they couldn't arrest him. Investigators decided instead to try to track down that person Clapman had seen walking around Randall Hall around 1:30 in the morning after speaking with Kurt and after radioing Ziegler. It would turn out to be 28-year-old PhD student Ashlyn Berhard, who was known for keeping long hours and was also known for sneaking up behind the female secretaries that worked in his office and suddenly holding a pencil up to their neck and threatening to kill them. His office also happened to be directly above where Debbie's body was ultimately found inside of that stairwell. When interviewed by police, Ashlyn said he had been in Randall Hall the night Debbie had been killed, but didn't know Debbie, had no interaction with her, and didn't leave his office the whole night. He quickly agreed to take a lie detector test, but he failed it. Scrambling to explain it, he named 2 other students that were in the office with him that could be his alibi. But when police spoke to these 2 other students, they said, no, Ashlyn was not in the office the whole time. He left around 1 in the morning and was gone for about 3 hours. He said he was going to take a nap. When the police approached Ashlyn with this information, he said, oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you about my nap. Yes, I left for a few hours. I stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, went back inside, and slept in one of the study hall rooms. But besides that, I was inside of that building for a full 24 hours, and I never saw Debbie. I had no interaction with her. It's just coincidence that my nap coincided with when she was killed. But detectives were not buying it. They believed wholeheartedly that now, finally, they had found their killer. But just like with Kurt and with Ziegler, they had no physical evidence tying Ashlyn to the crime, and so they couldn't arrest him. And because they were not able to make any arrests, the police just continued to look for more suspects. And so they began speaking to some of Debbie's friends and acquaintances, and it came out that Debbie actually had a stalker. It was another student named Alan Smith, who had previously been one of Debbie's very close friends, but at some point he wanted to take the relationship from platonic to romantic, and Debbie rejected him. Allen apparently didn't take this very well and took to following Debbie around campus, trying to get her to stop and talk to him and try to reconcile their relationship, but Debbie every time would just say no, and Allen got increasingly more angry about it, and just the day before Debbie was killed, their friends saw Debbie fighting with Allen in the middle of campus where Allen had actually grabbed her shoulder and was shaking her and yelling at her. Police tracked down Allen, and he was cooperative and said he did not kill Debbie, but he didn't have an alibi. He just said he was alone in his apartment on the night that Debbie was killed. And so, like all the other primary suspects in this case, there was no physical evidence tying Allen to the crime, and so they couldn't make an arrest. Around this time, the lab that tested the blood spatter that was on Debbie's chair inside of the computer lab came back with their results. DNA profiling was not available back then, so all they could provide was blood type. The blood type that came back from that little spot was type A, and Debbie's blood was type O, meaning this blood spot likely belonged to Debbie's killer, who during their struggle must have gotten wounded and then bled on the chair. And so right away, the police got Kurt Rayner, Bronson Ziegler, Ashlyn Bearhard, and Alan Smith to all come in and provide a blood sample, and they figured if any one of them was type A, that they probably were the killer. But unbelievably, when their test results came back in, none of them were type A. It was a crushing blow to the investigation. The first few days after Debbie's killing seemed so full of promising leads, but now with this blood type development, investigators had no suspects, and all of a sudden the Drexel community was starting to panic. Students were outraged at the light security and wondered why the security guards were not allowed to carry weapons. The administration put up a $10,000 reward for any information about who could have done this. And the president of the university told students to use the buddy system and never be alone on campus because he believed the killer was one of us. No one could understand why anyone would want to target Debbie in the first place. She seemed like such a wonderful person that was nice to everyone. She had modeled in high school, but she wasn't vain. She'd actually turned down getting braces because she was worried it might affect her clarinet playing. She was an average student, but she had an uncommon drive. She worked really hard to get good grades. Whenever she was feeling down or wasn't feeling motivated, she would stare at a picture of a Mercedes-Benz car that was there to inspire her and remind her what she could achieve if she continued to work hard. When she was killed, that picture of the Mercedes-Benz still hung above her desk. It was ultimately her work ethic that put her in danger because she was prepared to stay at that computer lab as long as it took to make sure her project was perfect. The few pieces of physical evidence the police had didn't fit together. The crime wasn't really a robbery. While she was missing her shoes and socks, her backpack had turned up at the campus lost and found about a week later, and no one knows how it got there or who put it there. Inside, it appeared all of her belongings were still there. Also, when she was discovered, she was still wearing her expensive watch. Her murder looked personal, but the police could not prove that someone who actually knew her was the one who killed her. Police considered a few other suspects, but like all the others, there wasn't enough evidence to make any arrests, and so eventually Debbie's case went cold. In 1985, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a story about unsolved cases that most haunted detectives, and Debbie's was one of them. Some of the detectives that were involved in the case said they believed this was a random killing and that the killer would most likely strike again. Debbie's case eventually disappeared from headlines, and it languished for 8 years. And then, in the spring of 1992, Debbie's murder was assigned to a cold case squad led by Detective Bob Snyder. And desperate to crack the case, Snyder threw a Hail Mary. He took the case to the Vidocq Society, which is a private and highly selective club of geniuses from all walks of criminology. Homicide detectives, prosecutors, defense attorneys, FBI agents, forensic scientists, even an aeronautic physicist. They came from all over the world for these monthly closed-door sessions where they would talk about these unsolvable cases and try to solve them. So in one of their monthly closed-door sessions, Detective Snyder stood in front of the Vidocq Society and laid out the details of Debbie Wilson's murder. Then he opened the floor to questions, and for hours the society got nowhere. Then Richard Walter, who was a founding member of the society, said that he had a theory. Walter was a famous criminal psychologist who had profiled some of the world's most infamous killers. Most of his work is actually still confidential. He believed the killer was a power-assertive, macho-type guy that liked being in control. Walter pointed to one clue that detectives and everyone seemed to have overlooked after all these years, and that was Debbie's missing shoes. He said the missing shoes were not random, they were the most important clue. The killer, Walter predicted, was a foot fetishist. Detective Snyder had nothing else to go on, and he was really intrigued by this idea, so he brought the information back to the cold case squad and they began re-interviewing everybody involved in the case. When they spoke with the manager of the computer lab at Randall Hall, he told them he was always bothered by one particular detail. The printers in the lab always turned off after 10 p.m., and so he was always confused how the security guard David Dixon could have heard the sound of printers inside the lab at 2:15 in the morning like he claimed. Detectives were shocked. Somehow no one had picked up on this discrepancy. They began looking more closely at David Dixon, who had been ruled out as a suspect and was viewed by and large as this pristine military veteran with no criminal history, and they dug all the way to the back of his military file where they discovered in 1979, the first year he was in the service, he had gotten in trouble for stealing another soldier's white Reebok sneakers, the exact type of shoe that Debbie was known to wear. Police began interviewing Dixon's former and current neighbors, and at least 4 women reported having a break-in when Dixon was living next to them, and the only thing missing was their white sneakers and dirty socks, although none of these women actually ever found out who was responsible. When they raided Dixon's apartment, they found in one of his closets 20 sets of used women's white shoes that were all wrapped in plastic like they were trophies. They also found 77 homemade videos, presumably shot by Dixon, that are just filming the feet of women walking around in white shoes. Dixon's alibi on the night that Debbie was killed was that most of the time he was on the phone with his girlfriend. His girlfriend had become his wife, and then she became his ex-wife. And so when detectives spoke to her, she told them that they had only spoke for a couple of minutes that night, not for a couple of hours. Police arrested Dixon in June of 1993, and he never admitted to anything, but as soon as he got into his cell, he started bragging to his cellmate about how he had killed Debbie because he wanted to have his way with her feet, and his cellmate immediately told on him. Dixon was ultimately found guilty of killing Debbie Wilson, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please recrust the 5-star review buttons Smucker's Uncrustables. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that sound just impossible. Moments that were so unlikely that they really should never have existed. Yet, somehow, they did. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Just a Bit Cramped, and it's about a horrifying accident that has a very unlikely outcome. The second story you'll hear is called Scenic Route, and it's about a woman who gets into a car accident on her way to work, but not everything is as it seems. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Out with a Bang, and it's about a funeral that ends with a deafening roar and chaos. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So, if that's of interest to you, please install hidden cameras all around the Like Button's house and then live stream that footage to Facebook. Okay, let's get into our first story called Just a Bit Cramped. At 4:45 a.m. on Saturday, January 17, 2015, a 27-year-old farmer named Caleb Whitby drove his pickup truck down a highway in southeastern Oregon. Caleb knew conditions for driving were not great. In fact, they were kind of awful. The road was icy, it was foggy out, the sun wasn't up, so it was pretty dark out, but he felt like he didn't really have a choice. He had to go pick up a shipment of cattle for his family's farm. After driving for another 10 minutes or so down this road, so it's just before 5 a.m. at this point, Caleb found himself right behind this big semi-truck who was going under the speed limit. And so Caleb's cruising along here, getting frustrated, and he's thinking about passing the truck. But when he kind of peeked around the side and looked up ahead of the truck, he saw there was a very sharp turn coming up, and he didn't really have enough runway to make the pass, at least not safely. And so Caleb just kind of throttled back and decided he would make the pass after making the turn. And so the semi-truck, which is right in front of Caleb, it ends up making this turn and gets out of sight of Caleb. And then a moment later, Caleb makes the same turn, and as soon as he does, he sees something that he couldn't have seen before. He's seeing it right now that sends a jolt of panic through his body, and reflexively, he jams on his brakes, he loses control of his truck, it starts to slide, and all Caleb can do is just brace and pray that he doesn't get killed. And then a second later, he heard a loud crunching sound, and then his truck stalled, and everything went quiet. But the silence was broken when suddenly there was another crunching sound, and at the same time, Caleb suddenly felt his lungs getting crushed together, and all the air was just pulled out of his body. Moments later, a different semi-truck driver was going down the same stretch of highway that Caleb had been, and he rounded that exact same turn, and when he did, he saw the same thing that had horrified Caleb and caused him to swerve out of control. Except this semi-truck driver, when he hit his brakes, he was able to basically maintain his truck, and he sort of gently hit the guardrail and, crashed, but it didn't cause any damage to him or really to his truck. And so after kind of composing himself, this semi-truck driver got out of the cabin and he looked out at this unbelievably horrific scene in front of him, and instinctively he knew if he goes forward and inspects this, he's just going to see dead bodies, and he didn't know if he could even handle that. And so he's just standing there in utter shock when he hears this sound. And he knows this sound is something that he has to go investigate. And so even though he was terrified of, potentially seeing dead people, he walked towards the sound, and suddenly he saw where it was coming from. And he just couldn't believe what he was looking at. It would turn out when Caleb Whitby rounded that corner and then saw this horrible thing that caused him to crash, well, what he saw was a massive pileup of over 24 cars just completely blocking the road. And so he smashed on his brakes and he tried to stop himself, but ultimately he smashed into the semi-truck that just moments before he had been driving behind. The semi-truck had also crashed. And so Caleb has now crashed into the side of the semi, and everything's silent for a second, and then another semi-truck comes around the corner. Caleb can't go anywhere, and that semi-truck blasted into the back of Caleb's car. After that, the other semi-truck, the third semi-truck if you will, rounds the corner, sees the pileup, hits the brakes, but this guy, he manages to crash into the guardrail, avoiding major injury and damage to his truck. And so he gets out of his truck and he's surveying this horrific scene, and he hears a sound. And he follows that sound right into the crash, and eventually he finds it. And that sound was Caleb. Somehow, when Caleb's truck was smashed from both directions, it created this perfect pocket of space just big enough for Caleb to fit inside of. And so despite being smashed together by two semi-trucks in this huge pileup, Caleb was basically unhurt. And so when this third semi-truck driver found Caleb, he actually was able to pull Caleb out of the wreckage, and minus a bruise and a couple of cuts on his face, Caleb actually was just fine and ultimately walked away. And in fact, after first responders showed up and cleared the wreck, it would turn out that incredibly, nobody was killed. Our next story is called Scenic Route. At 8:40 a.m. on July 7, 1967, a 17-year-old girl named Nancy McEwen was driving along a highway in Brooklyn, New York. She was on her way to her job as a secretary at her dad's office in Brooklyn, and she was coming from her home in Long Island, New York. Now, the commute to her office took about an hour, but Nancy didn't mind because her dad had just got her this beautiful brand new yellow Camaro, and she loved driving it.
And the highway she was on had this amazing view of the beach and ocean down below. And so that day, Nancy rolled down her window so she could feel the ocean breeze as she drove, and then she took in a deep breath and she smiled. At the same time Nancy was doing this, a police lieutenant was driving in his car a couple cars back from Nancy, and as he was just driving along, he suddenly sees this yellow Camaro that to this point had been driving completely normally, suddenly veer off the road, miraculously missed the oncoming cars, and then smashed into a tree on the side of the road. And so the police lieutenant instinctively jammed on his brakes and veered over to the shoulder and stopped behind the Camaro. And as the lieutenant got out of the car, he was thinking clearly the driver must have just had some kind of medical emergency because he didn't see any obstacles in the road. And, the car, the Camaro, had been driving completely normally to that point. So, what would cause them to veer and crash into the road at such a high speed other than a medical emergency? And so the lieutenant jumps out of the car, runs over to the driver's side window, and he looks inside and he sees this teenage girl, this blonde teenage girl, and she's slumped over the wheel. And she's not looking up at him. She's not making any sound. She's just sitting there. And so he opens up the door and he asks her, are you okay? And she didn't say anything, but she did moan. And so she was breathing, she was alive, and there weren't any obvious physical injuries. Clearly she's just crashed into this tree at high speed, so she's definitely shaken up. But there weren't any obvious grievous injuries that have occurred here, at least none that he could see. And so he asked her again, hey, are you okay? What's going on here? And she just continued to moan. And so again, considering he's looking at her and she seems, basically okay, all things considered, he thought, maybe she's drunk. That would kind of explain, the sudden veering off the road. And so at this point, the lieutenant radioed for backup and also called for an ambulance. And while he waited, he began searching the car, just basically looking to see if maybe there was some clue in the car as to what happened here. For example, containers of alcohol. And so he's looking around and he doesn't see any empty bottles and he can't smell any alcohol in the car. But still, this whole time, the girl is not responding. She's just moaning and just kind of slumped over there. And then a couple of minutes later, he hears sirens and he looks up and a bunch of first responders came over. They pulled the girl out of the car, got her in the ambulance, and off to the hospital she went. Once Nancy got to the hospital, medical staff was able to determine that she was not drunk. But she did clearly appear to be having some kind of medical emergency, but they didn't know what it was. And again, there was no visible injuries on her. She just basically looked really shaken up and was non-responsive. And quickly, after Nancy was at the hospital, her condition only got worse, to the point where doctors were giving her shots of adrenaline to try to keep her alive, but it didn't work. And at 11:30 a.m., roughly 2.5 hours after Nancy crashed into the tree, she died. And it was only then, after Nancy was dead, that the medical staff made a discovery, something they had totally missed when Nancy had first came in. And that was, on the back of her head, hidden amongst her hair, was a small circular hole. It was a bullet wound, and for some reason, it didn't bleed at all. Clearly, Nancy did not just randomly veer off the road and smash into a tree. No, she had been shot. About 30 minutes after this discovery was made, a detective named Albert Seidman was standing next to Nancy's crashed car on the side of the highway. Seidman had a reputation as being this totally no-nonsense detective who effectively would stop at nothing to try to solve a case. By this point, he'd already spoken to Nancy's parents, who obviously were devastated and very confused by their daughter's death. They said that, Nancy never got in trouble and certainly didn't have any enemies, and so it made no sense that somebody had just shot her as she was driving. And Detective Seidman had to agree. This was not an average murder case. But regardless, he knew the best place to start this investigation was Nancy's car. The car was actually in pretty good shape. Despite striking this tree at high speeds, the body of the car basically remained intact. And so Seidman began going inside the car and looking all around it, looking for bullet holes to see where this bullet came in and struck the driver. But he found none. Really, there was nothing in the car that gave any information away about what actually happened here. Also, adding to the mystery here is Seidman knew there had been that police lieutenant who just happened to be driving a few cars back from Nancy when she suddenly veered off the road and crashed. And he would say that he did not hear any gunshots, although admittedly he wasn't really listening for gunshots, but he said everything was normal and then the car just veered and crashed. He couldn't understand it. Detective Seidman had briefly considered that, maybe Nancy had been shot by somebody inside of her car. But because of the presence of that lieutenant, who immediately was on the scene and was basically looking at the car from the time it crashed all the way until the ambulance arrived, he said there was nobody else in the car and I did not witness anybody fleeing the scene. The whole situation was very bizarre, but Detective Seidman, thinking logically, thought, okay, well, we know she's been shot. So even though nobody knows how that happened, well, there has to be a shell casing somewhere for the round that struck her. And so for the rest of the day, Seidman and his team canvassed that whole highway all around that area looking for a shell casing, or really any clue that a gun had been fired in the vicinity, but they found nothing. By the end of the day, Detective Seidman was beginning to feel pretty disappointed about how the investigation was going so far, but he thought to himself, okay, well, I know I haven't found anything promising yet, but remember, she was shot not in some secluded area. She was shot on a major highway in Brooklyn, New York, a city of over 2.5 million people. I mean, someone somewhere must have seen or heard something. And so instead of continuing to look for a shell casing, Seidman abandoned that idea and decided to go find witnesses. Over the next 5 days, Detective Seidman and his team scoured Brooklyn and interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people, looking for anybody who had any information about this shooting. They also put out a public plea for information and were fielding tips that way. But at the end of those 5 days, despite the huge number of interviews, they really hadn't gotten anywhere. As Seidman began to feel his frustration rising, because once again, it just felt like they were hitting another dead end on this case, he told himself, they must have missed something. They've talked to a ton of people, but maybe they were too quick. Maybe they weren't asking the right questions. And so on July 12th, he gathered up his team and he circled some spots on a map of Brooklyn and said, look guys, we're going to go back to these key areas that are sort of positioned in the best angles to have maybe heard or seen something with the shooting. And we're going to ask some more questions and just see if maybe these people have something we didn't catch. In one of those circled areas, the police discovered a gas station that was owned by a guy named Theodore DeLisi, and it was located only 2 blocks away from where Nancy had been shot. And on the morning of July 12th, when the police officers rolled up to this gas station, Theodore was working and he saw the police coming towards him, and right away he knew this had to be about Nancy McEwen. So Theodore had been following this case really closely as it was developing for 2 reasons. One, Nancy had been shot really close to his gas station, so there's that proximity bias. And 2, Theodore was actually friends with Nancy's father and had known Nancy growing up. And so this case really hit close to home. When the police walked inside the gas station, Theodore immediately asked them, "Are you here about Nancy?" And they would say yes. And that's when he would tell them his connection to Nancy and how he was following this case really closely. But despite his proximity to where she had been shot, he said unfortunately he hadn't seen or heard anything. But then Theodore quickly followed that up and said that, well, while he had been at the gas station in the morning for a little bit, he did take off at some point to go fishing out on the water in his boat, which was not too far away. But even from there too, he still said he didn't hear or see anything. But it was kind of noisy out on the water anyways, so, he really wouldn't have heard anything out there anyhow. The police nodded and asked some simple follow-up questions to Theodore about, take us through what happened that morning, what'd you see, were there other fishermen out there, when you were at the gas station, did you see anything unusual, just kind of seeing if there was anything that would jog his memory. And Theodore was answering every question as truthfully as he could, and at some point, he began to think really hard about what he actually saw when he was out on the water fishing, and suddenly, it all clicked. Theodore knew who killed Nancy. It would turn out at 8:40 a.m. on July 7th, the exact moment Nancy was shot, veered off the road, and crashed, Theodore was in fact out in his boat fishing. Except at 8:40 a.m., he wasn't actually fishing. Instead, he had a can, and he threw that can into the water. And once he saw the can, he kind of kept staring at it, and then he raised his rifle and he fired a shot at the can. But he missed, and the bullet, by some fluke of physics, ricocheted off the surface of the water, went up into the highway right as Nancy had rolled her window down, struck her in the head, and killed her. Theodore knew he had been shooting his gun out on the water, but what he saw was the bullet hit the water. He didn't think for a second he could have fired up towards the highway. It was when police began asking questions that he thought, oh my goodness, it is possible a ricochet could have struck her in the head. Theodore was charged with homicide, but ultimately a grand jury chose not to indict him, citing that this truly was an accident. Theodore did not serve any jail time, but he was fined $100 for firing a rifle within city limits.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Out with a Bang. On the morning of June 20th, 2005, a 40-year-old man named Wang Diang stood just inside the doorway of a little home in rural northeastern China. Outside, it was pouring rain with all this crazy thunder and lightning, and also there were these hailstones coming down the size of golf balls, smashing into everything. I mean, just the impact on the roof must have been so loud. And so as Wang was standing in the doorway, he was actually looking out in the direction of the storm because all these people were running towards him to come in the house. Wang was actually hosting a wake for a friend, and he was hosting this wake at this man's home. And all the people running up to him were all the mourners coming to pay their respects. Now, by this point, most of the mourners had already made it inside the house, and so Wang was basically just waiting for the last few stragglers to make their way inside. And so from his post at the door, Wang is watching the storm and all these people, and he also took stock of the fact that as he looked out to the big tobacco fields that kind of were all over the place in this town, that was the primary way people made money in this town, he noticed that, there was nobody out there tending the crops. And even in rainstorms, people would tend these crops because this was their livelihood, but Wang understood why nobody was out there. Yes, it was the storm, but specifically, lately there had been these crazy lightning strikes in storms like this that struck the field. And so these workers that were normally out in the fields every single day, they weren't doing that anymore. Finally, the last couple arrived, and Wang greeted them and brought them inside, and then he shut the door and then began making his rounds inside the home, making sure all the guests had what they needed, and also just kind of making sure the wake was, overall a positive experience, all things considered. Now, to be clear, Wang was not a monk or a priest or even a relative of the person who was deceased. Instead, he was just kind of like the guy that emceed virtually all events in this town. So if there was weddings, he was the guy who officiated the weddings, and if there were funerals or wakes or things of that nature, also Wang was often tapped to MC that as well. He was kind of like the village elder, if you will, even though he was only 40 years old. And Wang, he really treasured the fact that he was the guy that got to do these things, and so he put a lot of time and energy into making sure they went extremely well. So on this day, as he was making his rounds, checking in with all the mourners, nobody really needed anything, and so Wang sort of felt like he didn't have a role, and he scanned around the room looking for something else he could do that would be productive, and he noticed the incense near the casket was going out. And so Wang walked over, he pulled out the extinguished incense, he got a new stick of incense, put it in, and he lit it, and then he just kind of stood over the casket and closed his eyes and began saying a silent prayer for the dead. And as Wang did this, suddenly there was this deafening roar, and then everything went black. A few seconds later, that deafening roar faded, and it was replaced by the sound of all the mourners in the house basically screaming and trying to figure out what just happened. And so as people began kind of trying to size up the situation, they saw there was all this smoke near the casket and there was all these wooden debris everywhere. And then people looked up at the ceiling and they saw there was now a pretty good sized hole that had blackened char around the edges of the hole that was kind of smoldering. And then unfortunately, once the smoke really had kind of dissipated, Wang was laying right underneath this hole in the roof and half of his head was gone. It was very clear he was deceased. And it didn't take long for mourners to figure out what had happened. Wang had unfortunately been struck by lightning. Two days later, Wang's family held a funeral for Wang, and basically the entire village showed up for this funeral because remember, Wang was really a central member of this community, and so it was a really big loss that he was now dead. And candidly, this only stoked the fears that everybody had about lightning strikes. I mean, this was really becoming a huge issue. But after the funeral ended and Wang had been placed into a hearse and driven off to the crematorium to be cremated, the people at this funeral who were kind of making their way out began kind of talking a little bit more candidly about what had happened to Wang. I mean, it was obvious he was struck by lightning, but in this town, there was a lot of superstition around deaths like this, when it seems like how he died is almost like an act of God. I mean, how many people get struck by lightning? Even if you're scared of being struck by lightning, that is a very rare phenomenon, and everybody knew that. And so the mourners couldn't help but suspect that maybe Wang was not this incredible person that everybody loved. Maybe he had deep, dark secrets, and the way he was killed was like God's punishment, smiting him for the terrible things he was hiding. But nonetheless, the mourners who had just left the funeral followed tradition and actually walked over to the local crematorium where Wang would be cremated. Basically, it's the absolute final goodbye, and typically the family will stay there and wait for all the people to come by and pay their final respects, and then at that point the family hands off their loved one in their casket to the manager of the crematorium, and the cremation process begins. And so all that happens, all the mourners go to the crematorium, they pay their final respects, and then before long, Wang's family was brought inside the crematorium with the manager, and they were placed in this quiet room to kind of wait for this process to happen, and then the manager left them and went down the hall to the furnace room where Wang's casket was waiting for him. So the furnace room inside of this crematorium is basically like this big industrial space where in the middle is this huge, intimidating metal furnace, which is actually where, the bodies are slid in and burned until they're just ash. And so picture like the biggest oven you've ever seen with a big metal rectangular door and these rails that slide directly into this furnace, and the casket is placed on those rails and then kind of fed into the furnace. They seal the door and then of course ignite the furnace, and then the cremation begins. And so the manager, who had done this many, many times, walked up to Wang's casket, which was already placed on the rails. Workers had already set it up for this process before he came in. And so the manager walks up to the casket, he opens it up, he sees Wang's body, and he confirms that Wang is just wearing a robe with a belt, and he did not have any jewelry or metal on him or anything like that, which was not allowed during the cremation process. And so feeling confident that this was all good, he shut the casket, and then slid the casket into the furnace. He shut the door, the big metal door, locked it, and then started the furnace. And as soon as he hit it, the manager heard the familiar sound of gas hissing as the gas kind of filled up the inside of the space, and then the familiar whooshing sound of the flames igniting. But as the manager kind of stepped away from the front of this furnace and was kind of making his way back towards the door, he noticed there was another sound coming from inside of this furnace. It was a hissing sound, but different than the gas sound. This was something else. And then before long, the hissing got louder and louder and louder. And then finally, there was this massive explosion inside of this furnace. And so smoke is pouring out of the sides. It was unbelievable that the furnace itself even held its shape. I mean, something massive had detonated inside of this thing. And in fact, even though that door that seals the furnace shut, even though it had not been blown off, the force of whatever detonated inside of there was so strong that the manager actually was knocked backwards from the blast. And so in a panic, he got up and there's smoke filling the room and there's flames kind of dancing out of the edges of this metal door in front of the furnace. And he hits the emergency stop and the flames cut, but it's still all smoky and it's totally chaotic and workers are rushing into the room to figure out what's going on. And the manager had no idea. This was something he had never, ever seen before. Just minutes later, firefighters arrived and basically extinguished the remaining flames that were kind of residually burning inside of the furnace and slightly outside of the furnace. Remember, this was a significant explosion, so there are cracks and breaks all over the furnace where some flames were still lit. But finally, the firefighters did extinguish all the flames, and then after it was safe to be in there, an investigation was launched as to what the heck happened in there. And so police officers went into this room and began sifting through all the debris in this room, both inside of the furnace itself and also, outside where it had cracked and things had shot off in different directions. And for a while, they found nothing. I mean, all they found were basically pieces of Wang, ash and some bone and some tissue from him. But there was nothing else that was unusual. But at some point, one of the officers did find something that was unusual. He found a piece of metal that was inside of the furnace that clearly should not have been there. Because remember, it's not allowed to have metal or jewelry or anything on the deceased when they're brought into the furnace. And considering what happened, they're like, okay, does this have something to do with the explosion? And so the officers kind of huddled around this metal and they began kind of cleaning it off to see if there was anything written on it. It's not a very big piece of metal. And eventually they had cleaned it off enough that they realized there was something written on it, and it absolutely explained what had happened here. So to understand what happened, you need to have an understanding of how the Chinese government responds to severe storms like the one that was going on the day that Wang was struck by lightning. So remember, Wang's village had all these tobacco fields all over the place, which was not only how the villagers made their living, but also China as a whole, they need these crops to be bountiful. And these huge storms that produce those golf ball-sized pieces of hail, those can severely damage tobacco crops. And the Chinese government doesn't want that to happen. And so the Chinese government has set up these things called weather bureaus, which are these government agencies all across the country whose job is to try to weaken these storms. And the way they do that is very interesting. They use a chemical called silver iode that they put into the actual storm clouds. And what silver iode does is it attracts ice particles and water. And so with this chemical up in the clouds, it kind of breaks up the hail a little bit and either makes them really small. And sometimes this chemical can actually completely destroy the hail and convert it from hail to just plain old rain, which is great. So how do these weather bureaus and this silver iode have anything to do with what happened to Wang? Well, unfortunately for Wang, the way these weather bureaus in China actually get this silver iode up into the clouds is they basically take a rocket launcher and fire a literal foot-long rocket, like an explosive device, that contains this silver iode inside of it, and the rockets get fired up into the sky, into the clouds where they detonate, and then the silver iode is kind of sprinkled all throughout the clouds. And unfortunately, on the day Wang was killed, one of those rockets were fired into the sky, and this rocket, it goes up, 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 it goes into the cloud, but it doesn't detonate. It turns around and falls straight down, and it just so happens to go straight through that roof into Wang's head, blowing off a portion of his head. And then the rocket itself, this foot-long rocket, got embedded in his torso and did not detonate. And then when he was wheeled off to the crematorium and slid into the furnace, and that manager turned on the furnace, that hissing sound he began hearing right before the explosion was the sound of that rocket inside of Wang's torso heating up and then finally detonating. When the police officers found that little piece of metal, what they had found was actually a piece of the rocket itself. And when they cleared it off, they saw there was a serial number for that particular Weather Bureau rocket. And so that was how they were able to solve this mystery. 3 years after Wang's death, the Chinese government came out and said, yep, this is our fault, we did this. And so they compensated Wang's family 80,000 yuan, which is equal to about 12,000 US dollars. And while that's a pretty underwhelming settlement to be paying for somebody's life, what is significant that came out of this case is following Wang's death, the Chinese government altered their rockets that they fired into these clouds, and they added this feature where if for some reason the rocket goes into the cloud and doesn't detonate, it will automatically deploy a parachute and will safely fall to the ground and not detonate.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 horror stories with completely unexpected endings. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called After the Riot, and it's about a man's son who mysteriously vanishes during a prison riot. The second story you'll hear is called Falling Treasure, and it's about a politician in Malaysia who calls upon a shaman to bestow riches and power upon him.
And the third and final story you'll hear is called A Son's Nightmare. And it's about police who visit a small village after a man's recurring nightmare about his mother makes him question reality. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Follow Button's house and dump out all their shampoo and refill the bottles with glue. Okay, let's get into our first story called After the Riot.
On the afternoon of October 11, 2016, a middle-aged man named Carlos Herrera Sr. entered the visitation area of a prison in Venezuela. The room itself sort of looked like a high school cafeteria, with tables and chairs everywhere for the inmates and their visitors to sit down and have their meetings. And right in front of one was one table where there was this bedraggled-looking prisoner who he was there to meet. As Juan got closer to this guy, he could see he really looked terrible, the inmate. I mean, his cheekbones were sticking out, he was sort of emaciated, he was bloodied and bruised, he had bandages on his arm. And also, as Juan moved towards this guy, he could clearly see all the guards that lined the walls and the exits of this visitation area sort of squirm with discomfort, as this meeting is about to take place. And Juan had a good idea why these guards might be anxious. And that's because over the past month, this prison had been on lockdown because a gang inside the prison had risen up and overpowered the guards and completely taken over for this entire month. And just to be clear, during this month, people died as a result of this takeover. This was a horrible month for this prison, and it was only over the past couple of days that the guards were finally able to take back control. And Juan knew all this, not only because this riot was all over the news while it was going on, but also because his own son, Juan Jr., was serving time in this prison for robbery. He had been for the past year. However, Juan Sr. was not coming to visit his son right now. Instead, he was coming to visit a different prisoner, because during this riot, Juan Jr. had just disappeared. And Juan Sr., when he had found out about that, had called prison officials, other people, politicians, you name it, to try to figure out where his son went, but nobody seemed to know. And so finally, he had found this one prisoner, the guy he was meeting today, this beaten down looking guy, who had agreed to come forward and tell Juan Sr. what he knew about what happened to Juan Jr. And so Juan sat down at this table with this prisoner, and after the two of them introduced themselves, very quickly, Juan Sr. said, "Please, tell me what happened to my son, where is he?" But this prisoner he was talking to didn't immediately get into sort of a clear story about Juan Jr. This guy began talking about a totally separate prisoner, a man named Dorangel Vargas. Vargas was notorious across Venezuela for a series of brutal murders he committed that ultimately put him in this prison. And during this recent riot at this prison, it was Vargas and his gang that rose up and took over. Vargas was in charge, effectively, of the riot. And so even though he was terrorizing people and brutalizing people and was very much responsible for the deaths of multiple inmates, he also at the same time did have to make sure that, the people he was in charge of, albeit illegally, had enough food, they had enough supplies, that they had the things they needed to survive. And so again, he's sort of dictatorial and awful, but also, ensuring people have basic resources. And so Juan Sr. is listening to this man sort of lay this out about Vargas and sort of how he was in control during this riot. And Juan Sr. is like, I just don't get it. Why are you explaining the nuances of what he was doing during the riot? And this prisoner very quickly pointed to the bandage on his arm and kind of pointed at all of his injuries that were very obvious. And he told Juan Sr. that if anybody got in the way of Vargas while he was in charge during this riot, they were basically beaten to within an inch of their lives. And again, in some cases, people were killed. This was a brutal regime. And so Juan Sr. is like, oh my goodness, is that what happened to my son? Was he beaten like you by Vargas? But at that point, the prisoner just shook his head and said no. And then he looked down and almost couldn't make eye contact with Juan Sr. And he just said, what happened to your son was much worse. The prisoner would tell Juan Sr. that at some point during the riot, his son, Juan Jr., was tapped by Vargas to help with something. Now, it's not clear if Jr. went willingly or he was coerced, but we know that basically everybody had to do what Vargas asked them to do, otherwise they would be beaten or even killed. And so ultimately, Jr. agrees to help Vargas. And the thing he was tapped to help Vargas with was distributing food to the inmates. Because remember, despite how brutal Vargas was, he was in charge of providing basic necessities to all the inmates. And because of this riot, the prison had been locked down, and so food supplies had been restricted. And so inmates are beginning to starve, there's this big food shortage, and so Junior was told, like, hey, you need to help us provide food to these inmates. And so Junior basically agreed to do it, at which point he was informed exactly what role he was playing in finding food. Instead of going out and looking for this food, Junior was the food. Vargas and his gang cornered Junior, beat him to death, butchered his body, and then literally fed him to the inmates. That's what happened to Juan's son. After hearing this horrific story, Juan Sr. was destroyed. And one of the first things he did is he went public and had this big press conference to tell the world about what happened to his son. But despite there being many eyewitness accounts, ultimately, the Venezuelan government denied the cannibalism and nobody was ever held accountable. Durangel Vargas remains incarcerated and he's never been charged with any crimes connected to Junior's disappearance. Our next story is called Falling Treasure. On the evening of July 2nd, 1993, a 49-year-old politician named Mazlan Idris paced around the living room inside of his home, which was located in a suburb of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Mazlan was feeling very anxious because tonight, in his home, he was going to have a very important meeting. So Mazlan was already a very successful politician. He was a state assemblyman, which is sort of like a state congressperson. But what he really coveted, the thing he wanted more than anything else in his political career, was to become the state's Menteri Besar, which is sort of like being the state's governor. But to get this role, Mazlan had to be appointed. And realistically, he didn't know if that was going to happen. And that was in part because recently he had felt like his political power was sort of, slipping away from him. And on top of that, he was getting older and he sort of felt like his popularity was waning too. And so he felt like, in order for me to get appointed to become the state's Menteri Besar, I really need to find a unique way to reclaim that political power and popularity. And that was going to be the central focus of the big meeting at his house that night. So Mazlan continued to pace around, anxiously checking his watch, waiting for these people to show up. And then sure enough, late that night, he heard a knock on the door. He hustled over to the door and he made sure he looked okay. And then he opened it up. And standing in the hallway is this unbelievably beautiful woman who's flanked by these two men that he didn't know. And immediately, Mazlan is just completely drawn to this woman. She had long dark hair, this huge smile, and her eyes, they sucked him in. It was like she was, hypnotizing him or something. She really looked like a celebrity, at least as Mazlan imagined celebrities look up close. This woman's name was Mona Fandi, and actually to some degree she was a celebrity. Back in the 1980s, she had released a pop music album that had been very popular all over Malaysia, and so she was kind of famous in Malaysia. Now, in the early 1990s, Mona was done singing, that part of her life was over, but she had launched this brand new second career post-music that, to some people, it seemed like that actually made her more notable and more famous than her singing had. These days, Mona was a highly sought-after professional shaman. So in Malaysia at this time, shamanism was pretty popular and mainstream. Shamans were these people who claimed to have supernatural powers. They could heal people and bring them prosperity. And so it wasn't uncommon for the really well-known shamans to be called upon by very powerful people, like, politicians, let's say, to sort of leverage their powers to increase their clout and their influence. And so Mazlan saw Mona, who at the time was arguably the most famous shaman in the entire country. He saw her as his meal ticket. She was going to be the way that he reclaimed the power he needed so he could be appointed as the state's Menteri Besar. And so Mazlan very excitedly welcomed Mona and the two men, who were her husband and her assistant, into his home. And, even though Mazlan had expected to see Mona tonight, he knew she was the one who'd be performing this ritual tonight, he still couldn't help but feel totally starstruck by her. And so as a result, he had a lot of nervous energy and he began sort of rapid firing, asking her questions about, how quickly will I see results and how's this going to go? And, how successful are these things really? And Mona, as she's just looking at him and smiling, she just eventually reaches out as he's talking and just puts her hand on his shoulder and says, "It's okay. Why don't you show my husband and my assistant where the room is, where the space is that we're going to be doing this ritual tonight?"
And at this, Maslin just totally shut up, and he nodded. He sort of got the hint that he was sort of being too much here, and he led them into this other room that he had cleared out for tonight. There was nothing on the ground. It was like a vacant room in his house. And right away, the assistant, he began spreading flower petals all over the ground, while Maslin began speaking to Mona's husband to work out payment details. I mean, this was not a free thing that he was getting. It was going to cost him the equivalent of tens of thousands of US dollars to get what he wanted here, to gain his power back. But Maslin didn't really care about how much this cost in money, because to him, it was absolutely worth it. And so once the payment details were handled, and Maslin was, ready, and the assistant had finished putting all the flower petals out, Mona walked over and told Maslin to come with her. And so he followed Mona, and they went into the ritual room that again is covered with flower petals, and she told Maslin to lay down on his back in the middle of the room. So he did that. He laid down, and he's looking up at Mona, and her assistant and her husband are off in the background, and Mona's got that big, dazzling smile, and she's staring right at him. She says, "Close your eyes and clear your mind. And all I want you to do is just focus on your desires for the future. What riches do you want to come to you? And focus solely on those." And so Maslin did this. In his mind's eye, he pictured himself becoming more politically powerful and more popular and landing the job of his dreams, and he's sort of narrating what he's saying out loud, and Mona's telling him, good, keep going, keep picturing those things. And then at some point she's like, "Look, I want you to picture riches raining down from the sky on you," sort of symbolizing you getting these things that you want. And so Maslin did that, and he began picturing the gold and the silver falling from the sky, landing on him, and he's narrating what he's feeling and seeing, and at some point he was so fixated on this idea of riches coming from the sky that he swore he could literally feel the gold and silver actually hitting his body. And at that point, when he was actually feeling something, is when the ritual was done. A little over a year later, on September 12th, 1994, the famous shaman, Mona Fandey, glided her way through a crowd of photographers on a street just outside of Kuala Lumpur. Mona was dressed to the nines. She had red lipstick on, her hair was all styled up, she had beautiful clothes on, and as she maneuvered through the crowd, she sort of feigned like she didn't want the attention, but she totally did. So it would turn out the ritual that she had performed on Maslin a year earlier had made Maslin incredibly famous. And in turn, it had made Mona even more famous than she already was. And so the paparazzi, they were desperate to get a photo of her because of her unbelievable fame. And for Mona, even though she acted like what she really cared about was being a shaman and helping people achieve their dreams and to heal and gain in prosperity, even though that's what she would say, the truth was, ever since she had that big hit, that pop music album that had launched her into the stratosphere, ever since then, she had been chasing fame. And now she had really nailed it. I mean, she was like an icon in Malaysia. And so, as she maneuvered past the paparazzi and everyone's clamoring to get her attention and to get her photo, she thought to herself, my plan has worked perfectly. Except, it's important to understand that, Mona wasn't really famous as much as she was infamous. And it really stemmed from that ritual she performed on Maslin. Because what she did to Maslin is she actually just ritualistically executed him. Except, it would turn out, Maslin wasn't even her first victim. He was her 8th victim, at least as far as we know, and she just got caught after she killed Maslin. When Maslin was laying in that room and the ritual's going on and he's being told to picture all these, gold coins and silver bars raining down on him, well, while he was doing that, and critically, he had his eyes closed, Mona grabbed an axe, raised it up, and brought it down into the middle of his chest. And so this ritual murder was designed to lead to somebody getting more power and more fame, except that person was not really Maslin, it was Mona. I mean, Maslin did become extremely well known for being a victim of Mona, but it was Mona who suddenly was the talk of the entire country. I mean, she was all over the news, and she was beautiful. And so it's like this crazy dichotomy of this unbelievably attractive woman who's also a serial killer. I mean, this is the stuff that just makes the news over and over and over again, and Mona loved it. And so when Mona was walking past that crowd of paparazzi and they're all taking photos of her, that was actually her walking to her murder trial. Every day, she would basically treat that walk up the steps to her murder trial as like her personal red carpet with all the paparazzi taking her photo. She'd dress up in these lavish outfits and smile for the cameras on her way to be tried for murder. And then ultimately, she was convicted of it and sentenced to death. But she was totally unfazed because for her, again, it was all about gaining this incredible notoriety, and she had succeeded.
It was like the ultimate shaman move, and she had done it. On the day of Mona's actual execution, she was going to be hanged, along with her assistant and husband. They too were found guilty. On her walk to the gallows, we have all these reporters and all these photographers, and she's still flashing smiles and treating it again like it's her own personal movie premiere. I mean, she didn't care at all that she's literally about to be killed. And then literally her final words as the noose is being put around her neck were, "I'll never die." The next and final story of today's episode is called A Son's Nightmare. One evening in February of 2011, a man in his 30s named Yang was eating dinner inside of his home in a rural village in China. Around him at the table were his 5 elderly aunts, who he lived with and took care of. Now, nobody spoke over dinner. It was totally silent, but this was common, and it was not awkward at all, because Yang actually preferred silence. He had been born with a disability that made it nearly impossible for him to speak. It also had left him blind in one eye, and over the course of Yang's life, he had been sort of bullied for his disability. And as a result, he really didn't like being around other people, and he certainly didn't like trying to talk to other people. I mean, that was really, again, something he had a really hard time doing. But in his life, the few people that totally accepted him and loved him were his family, in particular his 5 aunts. They didn't care at all that basically he never spoke. And so, for example, at this dinner table, there was no expectation that anybody would speak, and Yang loved it. But more than just feeling happy that he could be himself around his aunts, Yang also took a lot of pride in looking after his aunts. He wanted to make sure they were comfortable and well looked after in their old age. So after this silent dinner, Yang stood up and he cleaned the table off, and then he helped one of his aunts go up to her bedroom. And after getting her tucked in, and as Yang was about to go down and help the next aunt go to her bedroom, he heard sirens outside. Now, Yang lives in this very remote rural village in China that's actually so remote they didn't have their own police force. But even more specifically, Yang literally in his whole life had never even heard a siren or seen a police car. And so this is like really unique. And so instead of going and helping his next aunt, Yang went outside to see what was going on. And as soon as he got out there, he looked down the hill. He was up on top of this hill. That's where his house was. He saw at the base of the hill, about 600 feet away, were 2 police cars with their lights flashing. I mean, clearly something major was happening in his town. And so again, feeling very curious because he's never seen anything like this, Yang decides to continue to investigate. And so he leaves his home and begins walking down the road towards the cars. But he stops at a safe distance away because 1, he doesn't want to interfere, and 2, he really doesn't want to talk to the police because he can't really talk. And he's actually worried that he's going to get bullied if he talks to the police. And so from a safe distance, he just stood there and watched whatever was going on. And what was going on is the 2 police officers who had responded and shown up in Yang's village were standing there at the foot of this hill trying to make sense of this insane story a local farmer had just told them. The man was sitting there, his face was in his hands, he was crying hysterically, and he was trying to give them more information, but it was like he was too upset. And finally, one of the officers tells the guy, like, hey, stop what you're doing, start all over again, calm down, and just tell us the story from the beginning. And at this, the farmer did calm down, and after taking a deep breath, he told the officer the story. He said about a week earlier, he had this horrible nightmare. He said he dreamed of his mother and she was shrouded in darkness and she was terrified and she was screaming for his help. And the farmer said, in the dream, he ran to his mother to try to save her. But as soon as he would get close to her, it was like this shadow went over his mother and then she disappeared. And then the farmer would wake up and he'd be so terrified and so upset. Now, at first, the farmer told the officer that, he didn't think much of this nightmare. He was not a superstitious person. He just thought, it's a nightmare. But over the next several days, he kept having the same nightmare about his mother that, she was scared and then she would disappear as soon as he went to help her. And so after a week of these horrible dreams, the farmer said he finally decided, I'm just going to go check on my mother in person and make sure she's okay. But when he went to his mother's place, his mother was missing and he couldn't find her anywhere. And he had this horrible thought that she'd been abducted. And so he had called the police. Now, the police did understand that it was totally bizarre that they were here ultimately because of some guy's nightmare, but when they went to his mother's place, she really was missing, and so they ultimately told the farmer to just go home and that they would put together a search party and they would look for his mother. And so after the farmer said okay and then headed back towards his place, the two officers got back in their cruisers and they drove out of the village past Yang, who was still standing there watching everything happening, back to the police station. And there, the officers immediately coordinated two investigative teams that would go out and look for the farmer's mother. Now, one of these teams was sent to a local city to basically canvass the area to see if she was there, but that search proved to be fruitless. And then the other investigative team, they were sent back to the village. And when they were there, they went door to door asking all the residents if they had any idea what happened to this farmer's mother. And it was during this search in the village that they got a tip. And that tip would lead them to a very specific location, Yang's home. And when police went to Yang's home, they found the front door was wide open. But when they walked right up and yelled inside of the home, calling out for Yang, nobody yelled back. In fact, the home was totally dark and silent. And so after a few more minutes of police calling out for anyone inside the home to come out and talk to them and not getting an answer, the police decided to walk inside. And so into this dark, cramped home they went. And as they walked, they noticed there were all these dirty towels and dirty dishes and sort of trash everywhere. I mean, the place was kind of a pigsty. And again, it's eerily silent. Every step they took, they were walking on these boards that creaked with every step. And as they're moving, they're calling out, "Yo, Yang, if you're in here, come out." But again, it's totally silent. And they eventually make their way to the very back of the home. Now, the police really did not know what to expect when they showed up at Yang's place, but they did hope that by going there, they would somehow, some way find a reasonable explanation for all of this. You know, the dream that kicked off this investigation and this totally bizarre tip they got. I mean, they really just wanted to put this thing to bed, and they were hoping that by going to Yang's place, they would get that. However, when the police walked into the very last room they had not searched yet, the very back of his home, they knew there was no reasonable explanation here. That back room is where Yang's aunts all slept. And when the police walked into that room, sure enough, the aunts were in their beds where Yang had left them. However, the police realized, wait a minute, we have been yelling and screaming and trying to get people to come out of the home, yet all these women are still asleep. How could they possibly sleep through all that commotion? But as the police walked up to each of these 5 women, they realized the outlandish tip that had sent them here in the first place had to be correct. It would turn out Yang did not harm that farmer's mother. In fact, he did the opposite. She was one of his 5 elderly aunts, and he went to great lengths to care for each of these women. I mean, he basically would have done anything for them. However, there was a problem. His 5 aunts were dead and had been for a long time. While Yang considered these women to be his family, literally, I mean, he called them his aunts, in reality, he was not related to them at all. Instead, these were just women from the local village where he lived who had been nice to him. They had all died of natural causes. But Yang didn't understand it when they passed away. Instead, all Yang knew is that he was sort of an outcast and that nobody respected him and he was treated really badly by most people except for these women. They had been the only people that really cared about him. And so after they died, he felt really sad and lonely. And so one by one, he dug these women up and brought them home with him and began caring for them as if they were still alive. When that farmer had gone to go check on his mother after having the recurring nightmare about, her going missing, he had gone to her gravesite and found her coffin was literally empty, hence believing somebody had abducted her body. And then the strange tip police got that led them literally to Yang's house was a local had seen Yang carrying a body up the hill to his home. And his home actually was not a typical home. Instead, Yang's home was actually just a cave that he had outfitted with some boards on the ground for a floor and a couple of makeshift beds. Yang was arrested for what he did, but ultimately he was sent to a psychiatric hospital for treatment. All of the bodies that Yang stole were reburied, and the farmer's recurring nightmares about his mother stopped as soon as her body was returned to her grave. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The Mr. Ballen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley.
Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the Mr. Ballen podcast, you can also now watch on the Mr. Ballen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast features 3 stories about people with shared delusions. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Weird World, and it's about a girl who believed something was off about her family. The second story you'll hear is called Family Road Trip, and it's about a family's bizarre and abrupt exit from their home. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Madness, and it's about identical twins who went crazy on the side of a highway. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please remove all the raisins from the Amazon Music follow button's Raisin brand. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Weird World. Growing up, Pauline Dakin always suspected that there was just something off about her family. And years later, she would find out she was right. In 1970, when she was 5 years old, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. And to Pauline, it wasn't that much of a shock because her father, Warren, was a heavy drinker and he was extremely violent. But after they separated and Pauline, her mother, and brother had moved into another house on the other side of Vancouver, Canada, Pauline noticed her mom started to act really anxious all the time, but she never knew why. When Pauline was 9, her mother told her and her brother that they were going to go on a vacation to Winnipeg, which is 1,000 miles away from Vancouver. And so they loaded up the van, they hopped in, and they drove all the way to Winnipeg. And when they got out, they went inside their new vacation home, and Ruth informed her children that they were actually never going back to Vancouver. And when Pauline and her brother said, "Why? Dad's still back in Vancouver. I want to see Dad." But Pauline said, "Sorry, kids, this is the way it has to be, and when you're old enough, I'll explain everything." Confused and sad, Pauline and her brother began starting a new life in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, Pauline never saw her father, and so she lost touch with him. But she started making a couple close friends in Winnipeg, and she was starting to feel like this was home. But right as she was starting to feel normal, her mother told her and her brother that they needed to move right now all over again. This time they were going to go all the way to New Brunswick, the far east side of Canada. Their mother made them swear they would tell no one about this move. But later that day, when Pauline was with her best friend Wendy, she let it slip that she was moving, and so when Ruth came to pick Pauline up from Wendy's house, the 2 girls had to affect these sort of breezy goodbyes to each other so that Pauline's mother wouldn't suspect anything. Once in New Brunswick, the family did put down roots and they stayed there for many years, but Pauline's mother still was just incredibly anxious and paranoid about something. The kids just had no idea what it was. Fast forward to 1988, when Pauline was 23 years old, she had moved 2 hours away from the family home in New Brunswick and was living with her boyfriend and was working as a reporter at a local newspaper. And during that time, her mother called her and said, "Hey, I'd like to meet you at a motel. I'm finally ready to tell you everything about your childhood." Pauline was really intrigued and excited. This was a conversation that was literally decades in the making. And so Pauline eagerly went to the motel. She saw her mother waiting outside, kind of pacing around, looking very anxious. And so she walks up to her mom and she waves and she's about to speak when her mother just looks up at her and puts her finger over her lips, telling her to be quiet. and then she jammed an envelope into Pauline's hands, and on the envelope it just says, "Don't say anything, put your jewelry inside of this envelope, it's probably bugged, I will explain everything inside, just please don't speak." And so now Pauline's really confused, but she did as she was told. She took her jewelry off, put it in the envelope, and gave it back to her mother, and then the two of them silently walked into the motel, into the room where Pauline's mother was staying. When they went inside, there was a man sitting in the middle of the room that Pauline immediately recognized. It was the reverend of their church when they used to live in Vancouver. His name was Stan Sears, and Pauline's mother had been his secretary the whole time they'd gone to that church. Pauline always knew her mother and Stan were close friends, and in fact had kept in touch after they left Vancouver and were in Winnipeg and then New Brunswick. In fact, Pauline remembers periodically seeing Stan show up in Winnipeg and New Brunswick to visit with Pauline's mother. So it was a surprise, but not a total shock, when Pauline's mother confessed to her that in fact she and Stan had fallen in love. And in fact, they had had a secret relationship from the time they lived in Vancouver. But this revelation was nothing compared to what Pauline heard next. Her mother explained that the reason they had had to move so many times during her childhood was because Pauline's father, Warren, was actually a mobster and was a key member of an organized crime syndicate in Vancouver. Right after they separated, Pauline's mother found out she had a hit put on her head because the mob now believed that the husband could not control her anymore and she knew too much. Stan also found out that he had a hit on his head because Ruth discovered that the mob wanted to kill him too because they knew about their relationship. And then also, apparently Stan was counseling a man that was in his congregation that wound up being a mobster, and so the mob believed this man had given up critical information to Stan, making him even more of a liability. At first, Stan said he didn't believe any of this, but when he found out the man he had been counseling had been assassinated, he knew it was true. They decided not to tell the police and instead go into hiding together because Pauline's mother knew what happened to families that snitched on the mob. They were made examples of. And so when Pauline and her family moved to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan actually moved there as well in tandem, which is why Pauline had seen him periodically showing up at their house to visit with Pauline's mother. Pauline was understandably completely shocked, but at the same time, she was kind of happy to have some sort of explanation for all the strange things that had happened in her childhood. And so over the course of the next several hours, Pauline sat in this motel room with her mother and Stan and asked them every question she could think of. And she discovered that whenever she came home from school and she found her mother furiously pulling all the food out of the fridge and the pantry, throwing it all away with no explanation, that was actually because they found out the mob had tried to poison them. Or these 6 different times Pauline was unenrolled from the school she was at and then moved to a different school across town, that was because there was a credible threat the mob had discovered where Pauline was going to school. And so by the end of the weekend, Pauline not only learned about this totally crazy past she had, but she also learned that she was still in danger. And so before Pauline headed back home, she asked her mother and Stan what she should do to stay safe. And Pauline's mother said, "Well, that's actually the reason we called you here now, because after all these years, we were just tired of being in hiding, and so we've already spoken to the authorities, and they've moved us into a special witness protection program for families connected to the mob. When you enter this program, it's referred to as entering the weird world, where basically you're not really safe, but you have agents that follow you around that are undercover, that track what you're doing and make sure there's no assassination attempt on you." And before Pauline could even ask, her mother told her that as a measure of her and Stan entering the weird world, they asked that a couple of agents monitor Pauline and her brother, even though they didn't know they were being monitored. At this point, Stan reached forward with a radio and he said, "Here's a radio that actually broadcasts to the agents that are following you pretty much all the time. But you should only use it if you're truly in a desperate situation, because as soon as you call out for help, there are going to be people that are risking their lives to come save you." As Pauline is holding this radio, she looks at her mom and Stan and she says, "Well, what happened to Dad? Is he in jail?" And at this point, Pauline's mother says, "No, he's not. He's in the weird world too." And she handed Pauline a letter that was from her father addressed to Pauline, and it basically spelled out that he had been moved into the weird world and he was looking forward to Pauline joining them at some point when she was ready. So now Pauline has this radio and this letter, and she's looking at her mother and Stan, and she's just totally overwhelmed. And her mother just tells her, "Go home, think about what you want to do next, and if you want to join the witness protection program and join the weird world with us, just let me know and we'll make it happen." And so Pauline, who's in a total state of shock, gives her mom a hug and gives Stan a hug and says, "Okay, bye, I'll be in touch." And she leaves the motel and she gets in her car and she's about to back up when she looks and sees Stan running outside holding something in his hand. And so Pauline stops, Stan runs up to the window, and he says, "Hey, I forgot to give you this." and he held up this round piece of metal that he told her was a GPS transponder. It was magnetized, and she should put it out of sight underneath her car. And what it does is it constantly gives off her location to the agents that are following her. So if she was in trouble, it would be easier for them to find her. And so Pauline thanked him, put the transponder under her car, and Stan went back into the motel. And so Pauline went back home with the intention of just digesting this information, knowing that she was being watched, she had this radio, she was, relatively safe, and her plan was to just give it a couple of days before she committed to joining the witness protection program and joining the weird world. But after only a couple of days, her paranoia was so high that she dumped her boyfriend, she quit her job, and she moved out of her house into a separate apartment, and she called her mother and said, "I can't take it anymore, I feel totally unsafe, I want to join the weird world." Her mother and Stan were delighted at her decision, but they told her it wasn't a simple process getting into the weird world, that a lot of people were involved in her basically giving up her old life and entering this new one. And so Pauline's mother told her that she would be in touch with one of her agents and they would contact Pauline when it was time for her to go. And in that time, Pauline met a new boyfriend, Kevin, who became her husband. And in conversations with him, Pauline started to doubt this whole mafia thing was even true. And so she decided, in order to find out if this really was a real thing, that the mafia was actually after them, that Pauline would need to set up a sting operation on her mother and Stan. And so Pauline called her mother and very convincingly told her that, "Oh my goodness, someone just broke into my apartment. I think it was someone from the mafia. I don't know what happened, but can you tell me what to do? Should I call the police? What do I do?" And her mother said, "No, don't call the police. Whatever you do, don't call the police. I'm going to get in touch with Stan and see if he knows what to do." And just a couple of minutes later, Pauline's mother called back and said, "Okay, honey, I spoke to Stan and he spoke to the undercover agents that sit outside your house and have been watching you for all these years. And they said that yes, unfortunately, not one, but two men from the mafia broke into your house today. But luckily, they went up, they grabbed them, they're in custody, so you're safe now." And Pauline said, "Mom, I made that up. No one's been in my apartment. I've been here the whole day. I lied to you. No one broke in." And it was at this point that Pauline realized her mother and Stan had been living a lie since she was 5 years old. There was no mafia. Her father was not a mobster in some Vancouver crime syndicate. It was all made up. It would turn out Stan was suffering from something called delusion syndrome, where totally normal people that are totally lucid and have normal lives have one distinct delusion. And sometimes that delusion is not a big deal, but sometimes it is, like they believe the mafia is after them. And during his relationship with Pauline's mother, he passed on his delusion to her through something called Folie à deux, which translates to madness for two, which is shared delusion syndrome, where someone who's delusional, who's a dominant personality, can pass that on to a subordinate personality. After confronting her mother and then also confronting Stan at a later date, neither of them said, "This is a lie, you're right, you caught us," because they believed it, and they took to their graves the belief that the mafia was after them. Their biggest concern after Pauline said this isn't true was not that they had been exposed as potential frauds. It was that, oh no, Pauline's going to expose herself to the mafia because she's not using her GPS transponder or her radio or living in the weird world with us. She's going to get assassinated by the mafia. And so even though Pauline never got an apology from her mother or got to really talk about the insanity of this whole situation because, again, her mother and Stan took to the graves the belief that the mafia was in fact after them, Pauline ultimately made peace with the situation by writing a best-selling memoir called Run, Hide, Repeat. It is linked in the description below. Check it out. Our next story is called Family Road Trip. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone. And so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window. And so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Ballen Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. But when police went to the Trump family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Trump family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going, and the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot of pressure on our family, and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them, there was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was. She was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn hospital where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Ballen Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yass in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Trump family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Trump family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we just want to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Trump family was suffering from something called Folie, which is a French term that means madness for two. And what happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Tromps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this Folie theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Tromps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Madness.
After being apart for many years, identical twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were finally reunited on May 15, 2008. Within 24 hours of their long-awaited reunion, the 41-year-old Swedish sisters boarded a ferry for Liverpool, England. They arrived in Liverpool at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th, and their first stop was going to the St. Anne's police station, where Sabina would tell them that she's very concerned for the safety of her kids back in Ireland. The police would say, okay, we'll follow up, and they got in touch with their counterparts in Dublin, Ireland, who went over to the house and everything was fine. So the women leave the police station on foot and they make their way over to a bus stop, and they ultimately board a bus bound for London at about 11:30 in the morning. So they get in the bus and they start moving, and the driver asks them to take their luggage and put it in the luggage hold. But the women aggressively refuse to give up their luggage. And in fact, they start clutching their luggage against their chest. So the driver starts to feel really uncomfortable about having these two women on the bus, and ultimately decides to just pull over at a service station outside of the city and tell them to get off the bus. They get off, and the driver ends up calling the police and telling them there's something weird going on with these two women. I don't know what's inside their bags, but you might want to come check it out. As it happened, there was already a police officer at the service station who came right over to the women and started talking to them as the bus driver took off. During their conversation, the police officer felt like these two women were not a threat to anybody, and it was just a big misunderstanding, and they let them go. So the officer leaves, and these two women who don't have a car start walking down the highway on foot. Shortly thereafter, a security camera on the highway picks up the two women walking down the median of this very busy highway, and at some point, they try to cross the street. And it's obvious as you're watching this video that they're not going to make it. There's so many cars. And immediately, Sabina gets hit by a car. Now, Sabina was only grazed by the car, so she was okay, and she and her sister went back to the median of this highway. But enough motorists saw this happen that they called the police. And it just so happened that the responding patrol car that was in the area was being shadowed by a film crew that was filming for a TV show called Traffic Cops. So this patrol car shows up with cameras rolling, and they're able to get the sisters from the median over to the shoulder on the other side of the road. And they're talking to them like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And on camera, everything seems totally fine. Like, there is no major issues here. These women were just stranded and were making some bad decisions walking down a highway on foot. Then, all of a sudden, Ursula turns away from the officers and tries to run into traffic. And there are cars whizzing by. They have not stopped traffic. And one of the officers manages to grab her arm, but only gets her jacket, which she's able to wriggle out of before launching into traffic, literally leaping into traffic, and gets hit by a huge truck going 60 miles an hour and gets thrown down the road. Literally a second later, as everyone's like, what is going on? Sabina yells, they're gonna steal your organs! And she leaps into traffic and gets hit by another car. Immediately, police run in the road, they stop traffic, and they go up to Ursula, who was the first to get hit, and they see her legs are definitely broken, but she's alive. As for Sabina, she was totally unconscious, and they didn't know if she was gonna make it. When the paramedics finally show up, Ursula, who has the broken legs, fights to sit up, and they're trying to tell her, like, lay down, you're hurt, you have shattered legs, you're lucky to be alive, lay down. She's not listening. In fact, she's violently trying to sit up, and she starts spitting at the paramedics and the police and screaming obscenities at them like they're trying to hurt her. And they're like, we're the police, we're the paramedics, we're trying to help you. At the same time, Sabina regains consciousness, and even though paramedics and police are trying to keep her laying on the ground, she begins fighting her way up and is pushing the police off of her, and finally stands up and literally squares off with one of the police officers and decks her in the face before running down the road. Police would have to run down the road after her and literally surround her as she's got her fists up like she's going to fight anybody that touches her, and they would have to tackle her to the ground and put her in handcuffs just to keep her from hurting herself. Both sisters would be transported to the hospital, and when they got there, they both apparently were acting normal again. Ursula, because of her broken legs, would be admitted to the hospital, and apparently she would stay normal and would eventually make a recovery and would be released. There were no charges pressed against her. As for Sabina, the doctors checked her out and she didn't appear to have any injuries. So they released her and she was brought to the police station to be charged for punching the police officer in the face. That day, Sabina would plead guilty to her charges and would be sentenced to 1 day in custody that she served that night. The next day, she was released. So Sabina leaves the police station on foot, and later that night, she's walking down the road when she sees two men walking towards her who were named Glenn and Peter. She stops them and she says, "Hey, I'm looking for a bed and breakfast. Are there any good ones nearby?" And Glenn would say, "It's funny, I own a bed and breakfast. You can stay at mine." Initially, Sabina seemed hesitant, like perhaps this was a trap, but ultimately she agrees and the three of them go back to Glenn's B&B. Once they got there, Sabina apparently was constantly looking out all of the windows, acting very paranoid, and then at one point she offers the men a cigarette, and the men accept, and she hands them their cigarette, and she's about to light their cigarettes when she suddenly snatches them out of their mouths and says, "Oh, these might be poisoned," and she throws them in the trash. Just before midnight, Peter leaves, and Glenn and Sabina go to sleep in their respective rooms. The next day, Glenn gets up to make tea and food for Sabina, who's downstairs in the kitchen, but Glenn realizes he's out of tea bags. So he goes outside and he hollers to his neighbor Frank and says, "Hey, can I borrow some tea bags?" Frank gives him the tea bags. Glenn goes back inside. About a minute later, Frank recalls seeing Glenn stagger out of the B&B, clutching his stomach, screaming, "She stabbed me." And apparently his last words were, "Frank, take care of my dog," before he ultimately died. Frank immediately calls the police, and Sabina immediately leaves the B&B and takes off running. She gets to a highway and she's running along the side of this highway, and a motorist named Josh sees Sabina running, and she's clutching a hammer that she's repeatedly hitting herself in the head with as she's running. Josh drives well past her and gets out to try to intercept her, but as she's running past him, she pulls a roof tile out of her pocket and throws it and hits Josh in the head. She runs past Josh, who's now clutching his head and can't stop her. She gets to this bridge that overlooks another road, and she leaps off. It's 40 feet to the ground, and when she hits the ground, she breaks both ankles and fractures her skull, but she lives and narrowly escapes being hit by another car. Eventually, police and paramedics are called, who transfer Sabina to a hospital where she once again is acting totally normal. Nothing like the crazy person that killed Glenn or was throwing roof tiles just hours earlier. Sabina would ultimately be arrested for murdering Glenn, and she would plead guilty to manslaughter, but she gave absolutely no explanation of why any of this happened. It was like she didn't understand and was a different person now. The defense claimed that although Sabina certainly killed Glenn, she should have diminished responsibility because she was suffering from a condition known as Folie. And amazingly, the prosecution accepted this claim, and they only gave Sabina 5 years for her crimes. Sabina would serve her 5-year sentence and was released in 2011, and to this day is a free woman.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please remove all the raisins from the Amazon Music follow button's Raisin brand. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballen. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballen Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. If you want to check out our merch, join our Discord server, or just see what's going on at Ballen Studios, head on over to our brand new website, ballenstudios.com. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.